Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Daniel Lopez, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Ocala National Forest, Florida, in an area locals call the Big Scrub, a 47,000-acre stretch of sand pine and scrub oak that stretches endlessly under the brutal Florida sun. I should have known something was wrong when Marcus suggested the camping trip. Marcus Chen, our office's perpetually optimistic IT guy, had been acting strange for weeks, jumpy, distracted, muttering about getting away from it all. When he pitched the idea of a 4-day wilderness camping trip to celebrate landing the Morrison account, I figured some fresh air might do us all good. Our small marketing firm had been grinding through 18-hour days for months. "Come on, Danny," Marcus had said, his usually bright eyes looking hollow and ringed with dark circles. "When's the last time any of us saw actual trees? No Wi-Fi, no deadlines, just us and nature." The "us" included Sarah Rodriguez from accounting, a tough, no-nonsense woman who could field strip a spreadsheet faster than most people could read one, and Kevin King, our perpetually anxious graphic designer who jumped at shadows but created beautiful work when he wasn't having panic attacks about missed deadlines. We'd driven Marcus's beat-up Jeep Cherokee down State Road 19, past the tourist traps of Silver Springs, deeper into the forest until the asphalt gave way to sugar sand roads that wound between towering longleaf pines. The deeper we went, the more the modern world seemed to peel away like old paint. Cell towers disappeared. Road signs became scarce. Even the air felt different. Thicker, older, carrying scents of pine resin and something else I couldn't quite identify. Marcus had insisted on camping in the most remote area possible, somewhere called Sellers Lake, a small spring-fed lake tucked away in the heart of the wilderness, accessible only by a network of increasingly primitive dirt roads. "I found it on an old forestry map," he'd explained, though when I asked to see the map, he claimed he'd left it at home. The first sign something was wrong came when our GPS started glitching about 20 miles into the forest. The screen would flicker, showing our location jumping randomly across the map, then display error messages I'd never seen before. Signal interference, temporal displacement error, location undefined. "Piece of junk," Kevin muttered, nervously adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He was squeezed into the back seat next to our camping gear, looking increasingly uncomfortable as the trees pressed closer to the road. "I told you we should have printed backup directions." Sarah, riding shotgun, consulted a paper map with military precision. "We're fine. Road 445 should intersect with Forest Road 573 in about 3 miles. From there, it's a straight shot to the lake." But when we reached the intersection, there was no Forest Road 573, just an overgrown trail that looked like it hadn't been used in decades, blocked by a rusted metal gate with a sign so weathered the text was unreadable. "This has to be it," Marcus said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Sometimes these old roads aren't maintained." The gate wasn't locked. The chain had been cut, the ends twisted back together with wire that looked fresh despite the rust coating everything else. Marcus unwound it quickly, his movements jerky and nervous, as if he was afraid we might change our minds. The road beyond the gate was barely a path. 2 sandy ruts separated by a strip of scrub grass. Palmetto fronds scraped against the windows as we bounced through potholes filled with stagnant water that reflected the darkening sky above. The canopy grew thicker, blocking out more and more sunlight until we were driving through a green twilight that made it impossible to judge the time. "How much further?" Kevin asked, his voice tight with anxiety. I could see him in the rearview mirror, pulling at his fingers the way he did when deadlines were approaching. "Not far," Marcus replied, but I noticed his knuckles were white on the steering wheel. When we finally reached Sellers Lake, I understood why Marcus had chosen it. The lake was a perfect circle of black water, maybe 50 yards across, surrounded by dense forest that pressed in from all sides. Ancient cypress trees draped with Spanish moss stood knee-deep in the shallows, their branches creating a natural cathedral that filtered the remaining daylight into shifting patterns of gold and shadow. It was beautiful in the way that untouched places can be beautiful, and utterly isolated. The silence was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat, broken only by the occasional splash of something unseen disturbing the lake's surface. "Damn," Sarah breathed, shouldering her backpack. "It's like we've gone back in time." We set up camp on a small clearing about 20 yards from the water's edge, the only spot that wasn't choked with undergrowth. The ground was soft sand mixed with centuries of decomposed leaves, and as we worked, I noticed odd things. Perfect circles of dead grass, as if something had been burned there long ago. Scratches in the bark of nearby trees that looked almost like symbols, and everywhere, the feeling of being watched. Kevin was struggling with his tent, his hands shaking as he tried to thread the poles through the fabric. "Guys," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "does anyone else feel like we shouldn't be here?" "It's just the isolation," Sarah said firmly, though I noticed she kept glancing over her shoulder as she arranged her gear. City kids aren't used to real wilderness. But I knew what Kevin meant. There was something wrong with this place, something that made my skin crawl and the hair on my arms stand up. The silence was too perfect, too complete. In all my years of camping, I'd never been anywhere that felt so utterly devoid of animal life. No birdsong, no insect buzz, no rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. Just that oppressive, watchful silence. As the sun set, the feeling only intensified. We'd built a fire in a ring of stones Marcus claimed was already there, though I couldn't remember seeing it when we'd first arrived, and the flames cast dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of the light. The darkness beyond our small circle felt solid, impenetrable, as if it had weight and substance. "Anyone want to tell ghost stories?" Marcus asked with forced cheerfulness, but his laugh sounded hollow. "How about we just enjoy the quiet?" I suggested, though quiet wasn't the right word for what surrounded us. The silence had a quality that made me want to whisper, as if speaking too loudly might wake something that was better left sleeping. We tried to make the best of it, sharing trail mix and warm beer, talking about work and weekend plans. But the conversation kept dying, swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere of the place. Even Sarah, usually unflappable, seemed on edge, her eyes constantly scanning the tree line. When we finally decided to turn in, I noticed Marcus's sleeping bag was positioned facing the lake while the rest of ours faced the forest. When I mentioned it, he just smiled that strange, hollow smile and said he liked the view. I should have paid more attention to that detail. I woke sometime in the deepest part of the night to the sound of splashing. Not the random splash of a fish or gator. This was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone swimming. I lay still in my sleeping bag, listening to the steady stroke splash echoing across the water. But when I unzipped my tent and peered out, the lake was perfectly still, its surface like black glass reflecting the stars. No ripples, no movement, nothing to explain what I'd heard. Marcus's tent was dark and silent, Sarah and Kevin's breathing audible from their respective shelters. I was about to zip my tent closed when I noticed something that made my blood run cold, wet footprints leading from the lake's edge to Marcus's tent, then back again. Large, barefoot prints that seemed to have extra toes. In the morning, the prints were gone, erased by the soft sand that seemed to shift and settle during the night. When I mentioned what I'd seen, Marcus just shrugged and said I must have been dreaming. But I caught him glancing toward the lake with an expression I couldn't read. Anticipation mixed with something that might have been fear. The second day brought new strangeness. Our food, carefully sealed in bear-proof containers, had somehow spoiled overnight. The bread was covered in black mold that looked weeks old. The fruit had rotted from the inside out, leaving shells of skin containing nothing but putrid liquid. Even our canned goods had swelled and burst, their contents rancid and crawling with maggots that shouldn't have been able to penetrate sealed metal. "Must be the humidity," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. She was staring at a can of beans that had somehow rusted through completely, its contents now a writhing mass of decay. Kevin was openly panicking now, pacing back and forth and pulling at his hair. "This isn't normal," he kept repeating. "Food doesn't just rot like this. Metal doesn't rust through overnight. We need to leave. We need to leave now." But Marcus insisted we stay. "We came here to get away from everything," he said, his voice taking on an edge I'd never heard before. "One more night. What's the worst that could happen?" That afternoon, while Sarah tried unsuccessfully to get a cell signal and Kevin huddled in his tent muttering about unnatural decay patterns, Marcus announced he was going to gather firewood from deeper in the forest. "Don't go alone," I warned, but he just smiled that increasingly unsettling smile and said he'd be fine. He was gone for 3 hours. When he came back, something was wrong. Not obviously wrong. He looked the same, sounded the same, even smelled like pine sap and sweat the way you'd expect after bushwhacking through dense forest. But there were subtle differences that made my skin crawl. He blinked too infrequently, his eyes staying open just a fraction of a second too long between blinks. When he smiled, it lingered past the point of comfort, as if he'd forgotten when to stop. And his movements had a strange, fluid quality, like he was concentrating on how to operate his own body. "Find any good wood?" Sarah asked. Marcus turned to look at her, and I swear it took him a moment to process the question, as if he was translating it from another language. "Wood," he said finally. "Yes. Gathered. Firewood." The pause before firewood was barely perceptible, but it was there, as if he'd almost said something else. That evening, sitting around the fire Marcus had built with his mysteriously acquired wood, I noticed other changes. He kept staring at each of us with an intensity that made me uncomfortable, his gaze lingering on our faces, our hands, our movements with the focused attention of someone memorizing details. When Kevin mentioned being homesick for his apartment, Marcus cocked his head like a confused dog and asked, "Home? Sick? You are ill for your dwelling place?" Kevin laughed nervously. "It's just an expression, man. It means missing home." "Ah," Marcus said, but his smile was slightly off-center, as if he was wearing someone else's face and hadn't quite figured out how to make it fit properly. The fire burned strangely that night. The flames were too blue, too bright, and they seemed to move independently of any wind. Worse, they cast shadows that didn't match our positions around the fire ring. I would lean left, but my shadow would lag behind, as if it was trying to figure out which way I'd moved. "Does anyone else notice?" I started to say, but Marcus cut me off. "Notice what, Daniel?" he asked, and hearing my name in his mouth made me shudder. It sounded wrong, like he was tasting the syllables. "Nothing," I said quickly. "Just tired." But sleep didn't come easily that night. I lay in my tent listening to sounds that shouldn't exist. Whispered conversations in a language that hurt my ears, soft splashing from the lake despite the complete absence of wind, and worst of all, the sound of someone, or something, moving around our campsite with footsteps that were just slightly out of sync, as if whatever was walking was still learning how to coordinate its limbs. Sometime before dawn, I heard Kevin scream. I was out of my tent in seconds, flashlight in hand, heart hammering against my ribs. Kevin's tent was empty, his sleeping bag still warm but unzipped from the inside. A trail of disturbed sand led toward the lake, but it ended abruptly at the water's edge. "Kevin!" Sarah shouted, her voice cracking with panic. "Kevin!" The lake surface rippled in response to her voice, but there was no answer. Marcus stood at the edge of our camp, staring at the water with that same unreadable expression. "He probably went for an early morning swim," he suggested, but his tone was flat, emotionless. "Kevin can't swim," I said, and Marcus turned those two bright eyes on me. "Can't swim," he repeated slowly as if testing the words. "Cannot swim." "Yes," I remember now. But his smile said otherwise. We searched the shoreline until noon, calling Kevin's name until our voices were hoarse. Sarah found his glasses about 10 feet into the forest, the lenses spider-webbed with cracks, but there was no other sign of him. The sand around the lake showed no tracks, no indication that anything had emerged from or entered the water. "We have to get help," Sarah said, her usual composure finally cracking. "We have to call the rangers, the police, someone." But our phones showed no signal, not even for emergency calls. The screens flickered with the same error messages our GPS had displayed, and when I tried to use the emergency beacon I'd brought as backup, it beeped once and died, its LED display showing gibberish characters that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. "We need to hike back to the main road," I said. "Get to somewhere with cell coverage." Marcus stepped between us and the path leading out of our camp. "We can't leave," he said, and for the first time since he'd returned from gathering wood, his voice sounded completely normal. "Not yet." "The hell we can't," Sarah snapped. "Kevin is missing, our equipment is malfunctioning, and something is seriously wrong with this place." "Something is wrong," Marcus agreed, and his smile widened to show too many teeth. "But leaving won't fix it." That's when I noticed his eyes. They were the same brown they'd always been, but there was something moving behind them, something that looked like dark water with things swimming in it. Sarah saw it too. I heard her sharp intake of breath, watched her take an involuntary step backward. "Marcus," I said carefully, the way you might speak to a wild animal, "are you feeling all right?" He tilted his head at an angle that was just slightly too far, studying me with predatory intensity. "I feel different," he admitted. "Better, clearer, like I've been wearing a mask my whole life and finally taken it off." "What happened to you out there?" Sarah demanded, though her voice shook. "What did you find in the woods?" Marcus's laugh was like breaking glass. "I didn't find anything," he said. "Something found me." He began to change as we watched, his features shifting and flowing like clay in warm hands. His skin took on a grayish pallor, and dark veins became visible beneath the surface, pulsing with something that wasn't quite blood. His fingernails lengthened into claws, and when he smiled, his teeth were sharp and numerous. But the worst part was that he was still recognizably Marcus, still wore his favorite camping shirt, still had that scar on his chin from a childhood bike accident. Whatever had taken him hadn't replaced him. It had infected him, twisted him into something new while leaving just enough of the original to make it horrible. "The water called to me," he said, his voice now carrying an odd echo, as if he was speaking from the bottom of a well. "It showed me what I could become, what we all could become." Sarah was backing toward her tent, reaching for something in her pack. I hoped it was the flare gun she'd mentioned bringing, but Marcus moved faster than should have been possible, crossing the distance between them in a fluid motion that was more glide than run. His hand clamped down on her wrist with a wet sound, and where he touched her, her skin began to change. Dark veins spread from the contact point like spilled ink, and Sarah screamed, a sound of pure terror that echoed across the lake and seemed to be answered by something deep underwater. "It doesn't hurt," Marcus whispered, his face inches from hers. "The change. It's like coming home." I grabbed the first thing I could find, a heavy camping hatchet from our supply pile, and swung it at Marcus's arm. The blade bit deep, but instead of blood, a thick, dark liquid poured from the wound. It smelled like stagnant water and rotting vegetation. Marcus turned those alien eyes on me, and I saw something in them that was worse than anger. Amusement. "Daniel," he said, my name rolling off his tongue like a caress. "Sweet, loyal Daniel. Always trying to fix things, always trying to save everyone." He released Sarah, who collapsed to her knees, clutching her arm. The veins were spreading up toward her shoulder, and where they passed, her skin took on that same grayish pallor. "You can't stop what's already begun," Marcus continued, stalking toward me with that horrible fluid grace. The lake has been waiting so long for visitors, for fresh material. I swung the hatchet again, but he caught it effortlessly, his fingers wrapping around the metal head with a sound like wet leather. When he squeezed, the steel crumpled like tin foil. That's when Sarah proved why she'd been hired as our office's crisis manager. Despite the infection spreading through her system, she'd managed to reach her pack and extract not a flare gun, but something better, a can of bear spray. The pressurized capsaicin hit Marcus full in the face, and he recoiled with a shriek that sounded like steam escaping from a burst pipe. The thing that had been our friend clawed at its eyes, dark fluid streaming from its tear ducts. "Run!" Sarah shouted, struggling to her feet. The dark veins had reached her neck, and her left eye was beginning to change color. We ran. Through the dense underbrush, following the barely visible trail that led back toward the main road. Behind us, I could hear Marcus, or what Marcus had become, crashing through the forest in pursuit, but its movements were erratic, confused by the chemical attack. Sarah was slowing down, the infection spreading through her system with each heartbeat. Her breathing became labored and she stumbled frequently, her coordination deteriorating as whatever was in her bloodstream reached her brain. "Leave me," she gasped as we reached a small clearing about a mile from our campsite. It's in my head now. I can hear it whispering." "No way," I said, grabbing her arm to help her along, but where I touched her, my skin began to tingle and I realized the infection might be contagious through contact. Sarah must have realized it too. She jerked away from me, her face contorting with the effort of fighting whatever was growing inside her. "Daniel," she said, and her voice was already changing, taking on that wet, echoing quality that Marcus's had developed. "You have to understand. It's not evil. It's just hungry. It's been sleeping in that lake for so long, and we woke it up." Dark veins were now visible across her face, and her eyes had taken on that same swimming with movement quality I'd seen in Marcus. But she was fighting it, using her iron will to maintain some semblance of herself even as the thing transformed her from the inside out. "There's a ranger station," she managed to say, "about 5 miles north on Forest Road 40. If you can get there, warn them. Don't let anyone else come to the lake." "Sarah!" "Go!" she screamed, and the sound that emerged was no longer entirely human. I ran, through scrub oak and palmetto, over sandy soil that seemed to shift and try to trap my feet, past stands of longleaf pine that whispered with voices that weren't quite wind. The forest felt alive around me, malevolent and aware, as if the thing in the lake had infected not just Marcus and Sarah, but the very ecosystem itself. My lungs burned, my legs felt like lead, but I kept moving. Behind me, I could hear sounds of pursuit, not just the crashing of something large moving through the underbrush, but other sounds. Splashing, as if something was keeping pace with me through the water table that ran beneath the forest floor. Whispers in languages that predated human speech. And worst of all, voices I recognized calling my name. "Daniel," came Marcus's voice from somewhere to my left. "Where are you going? We're your friends." "Danny," Sarah's voice echoed from my right, but with that horrible wet quality that made my skin crawl. "Come back. It's wonderful. You'll see." And then, impossibly, Kevin's voice from directly ahead. "Help me, Danny. I'm lost. I can't find my way back." But Kevin was dead. I'd seen his empty tent, found his broken glasses. Whatever was calling to me might sound like Kevin, but it wasn't him. It was the thing that had taken Marcus. That was taking Sarah. And now it was trying to take me. I forced myself to ignore the voices, to focus on the path ahead. The sun was setting, and the forest was growing dark with unnatural speed. Shadows seemed to move independently of their sources, reaching toward me with grasping fingers made of darkness. My phone, useless for communication, still had a working flashlight. The LED beam cut through the gathering gloom, illuminating stands of trees that seemed to shift position when I wasn't looking directly at them. More than once, I was sure I saw faces in the bark. Marcus's face, Sarah's face, even Kevin's, all watching me with those same swimming eyes. The ranger station materialized out of the darkness like a mirage. A small prefab building with a radio antenna and a single light burning in the window. I stumbled toward it, my legs finally giving out as I reached the wooden steps leading to the front door. Ranger. Tom Nakamura found me there 20 minutes later, collapsed and babbling about lake monsters and infected friends. He was a compact, weathered man in his 50s who'd spent his entire career in the Forest Service, and he listened to my story with the patient expression of someone who'd heard similar tales from lost hikers before. "Son," he said gently, "you've been through something traumatic. Dehydration, exhaustion, maybe some hallucinations brought on by stress. It happens more than you'd think." But when he tried to radio for a search and rescue team to look for my missing friends, his equipment malfunctioned in the same way ours had. The radio produced only static punctuated by voices speaking in that same incomprehensible language I'd heard in the forest. "That's unusual," Ranger Nakamura admitted, frowning at his radio set. "This equipment was just serviced last week." He tried his cell phone next, but it showed the same error messages mine had displayed. Even his landline produced nothing but silence when he picked up the receiver. "We're going to have to drive to the main station," he said, reaching for his keys. "I've got a truck parked around back." But when we went outside, the truck was gone. In its place was a pool of dark water that hadn't been there before, perfectly circular and so deep that our flashlight beams couldn't find the bottom. Ranger Nakamura stared at the impossible sight, his professional calm finally cracking. 30 years, he whispered. 30 years I've worked these woods, and I've never seen anything like this." From the depths of the pool came a sound like whale song, deep and mournful and utterly alien. The water began to bubble and churn, and shapes moved beneath the surface, shapes that might have been faces or hands or something else entirely. "We need to get inside," I said, grabbing the ranger's arm. "Now." We barricaded ourselves in the station, pushing furniture against the doors and windows. Outside, we could hear them moving around the building. Marcus, Sarah, maybe Kevin, maybe others. They scratched at the walls with claws that sounded like fingernails on a chalkboard, and they whispered our names with voices that grew less human with each repetition. "What are they?" Ranger Nakamura asked, checking his shotgun for the third time. "I don't know," I admitted. "Something from the lake. Something old." We waited through the longest night of my life. The things outside never stopped moving, never stopped whispering, never stopped trying to find a way in. Occasionally, one of them would speak in a voice I recognized. Marcus asking me to open the door, Sarah promising that everything would be all right, Kevin crying for help in a voice that broke my heart even though I knew it wasn't really him. The worst moment came around 3 a.m., when I heard my own voice outside the window. "Tom," it said in my exact tone and inflection, "it's Daniel. I'm hurt. Please let me in." Ranger Nakamura looked at me with wide eyes, his shotgun trembling in his hands. Outside, my doppelganger continued pleading for help, describing injuries in vivid detail, begging to be allowed inside. "How is it doing that?" the ranger whispered. "It learns," I said, remembering how Marcus had seemed to be memorizing our faces and voices. "It watches, it listens, it adapts." Dawn couldn't come fast enough. When the first rays of sunlight penetrated the forest canopy, the sounds outside gradually faded. The whispers stopped, the scratching ceased, and an almost normal quiet settled over the station. We waited another hour before cautiously opening the door. The clearing around the station was empty, but the ground was covered with tracks. Some human, some not, all leading back toward the interior of the forest. The pool where the ranger's truck had been was gone, leaving only a circle of dead grass and the lingering smell of stagnant water. Ranger Nakamura's backup radio, an old CB unit he'd forgotten about, suddenly crackled to life. The static cleared, and we were able to contact the main ranger station 20 miles away. A rescue team arrived 2 hours later, but they found no trace of my friends or the lake where we'd camped. According to the official maps, there was no Sellers Lake in that part of the forest. Never had been. The GPS coordinates I provided led to nothing but dense scrubland with no sign that anyone had ever camped there. Even the road we'd taken to reach the lake seemed to have vanished, leaving only unbroken forest. The investigators concluded that I'd suffered a psychotic break brought on by stress and exhaustion. My friends had probably died in some mundane accident, drowning, animal attack, getting lost, and my mind had created an elaborate fantasy to cope with the trauma. But Ranger Nakamura knew better. He'd heard them outside his station, seen the impossible pool of water, felt the wrongness that seemed to radiate from that part of the forest. He put in for a transfer the next week and moved to a desk job in Tallahassee. I tried to return to normal life, but normal was gone forever. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Marcus's changing face, Sarah's spreading infection, heard Kevin's impossible voice calling for help. I couldn't sleep without medication, couldn't be alone without panic attacks, couldn't look at any body of water without remembering the sound of something large moving beneath the surface. The official investigation was closed after 6 months. My friends declared legally dead. But I know they're not dead. They're still out there, in some lake that exists between the mapped world and Nightmare, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting campers to find them. Or maybe they're looking for me. 6 months after the incident, I started receiving text messages from Marcus's phone number. Just single words at first. Daniel. Miss. Come. Back. But gradually they've become more complex, more desperate. We're waiting for you. The water is warm. Join us, Daniel. Complete the circle. I've changed my number 3 times, but the messages keep coming. They know where I am, what I'm doing, who I'm with. Sometimes I catch glimpses of familiar faces in crowds, but they vanish when I look directly at them. Last week, I found a puddle of dark water in my apartment bathroom that hadn't been there when I left for work. It smelled like the lake, and when I bent down to examine it, I swear I saw movement in its depths. The thing is spreading, searching, adapting. It took my friends, and now it wants me. It wants to complete whatever process it started in that impossible place where time moves wrong and the laws of nature bend to accommodate something that should never have existed. I'm writing this account because I don't think I have much time left. The dreams are getting stronger, more vivid. In them, I'm back at the lake, and Marcus and Sarah and Kevin are there waiting for me. They look normal again, happy even, and they welcome me with open arms. When I wake up, my skin is damp with lake water, and my reflection in the mirror seems just slightly off, like it's a fraction of a second behind my actual movements. If you're reading this, stay away from remote lakes in Ocala National Forest. Don't trust your GPS if it starts malfunctioning. Don't camp anywhere that feels too quiet, too perfect, too isolated. And if someone you care about goes missing and comes back acting strangely, don't give them the benefit of the doubt. Run, because whatever's wearing their face isn't them anymore, and it's hungry for more. The water is calling to me now. I can hear it whispering from every faucet. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the remote backcountry of Big Cypress National Preserve, about 40 miles southeast of Immokalee, Florida, where the cypress swamps give way to endless sawgrass prairies and hammocks of ancient oak trees that have stood since before the Seminole Wars. David Jones and I had been planning this camping trip for months. We'd both been grinding through 60-hour weeks at the engineering firm, and the idea of disconnecting completely, no cell service, no emails, just us and the wilderness, felt like exactly what we needed. David had found this spot on some obscure hiking forum, a backcountry camping area near Turner River that supposedly offered some of the most pristine wilderness experience left in South Florida. "Look at this," David had said, showing me grainy photos on his laptop. No developed campsites, no trails marked on any official maps. just pure, untouched Florida like it was 300 years ago. I should have paid more attention to why it wasn't on any official maps. We drove down from Tampa on a Friday afternoon in early November, when the humidity finally breaks and you can actually breathe outdoors. David's beat-up Jeep Cherokee was loaded with enough gear for a week, though we were only planning 3 days. He was always the over-preparer, the guy who brought 2 backup flashlights and enough food for twice as many people. I used to tease him about it. The drive took us through increasingly remote country. After leaving I-75, we wound through 2-lane roads flanked by cattle ranches and citrus groves, then smaller roads through pine flatwoods and palmetto scrub. The last 20 miles were on unpaved roads that didn't appear on my GPS, following hand-drawn directions David had gotten from someone on that hiking forum. "You sure this guy knew what he was talking about?" I asked as we bounced through another pothole that probably took a year off the Jeep's suspension. "Relentless Tracker 87 has posted some amazing stuff," David said, white-knuckling the steering wheel. "Look, there's the abandoned ranger station he mentioned." Sure enough, a small concrete building sat collapsed beside the road, its roof caved in and walls covered with strangler figs. A rusted sign barely visible through the vegetation read, "Turner River District, Big Cypress NP." The paint had faded to ghosts of letters. We parked at what David's contact had called the trailhead, really just a slightly wider spot beside the road where the cypress trees gave way to a gap barely wide enough for single-file hiking. No signs, no trail markers, nothing official, just a narrow opening in the green wall that stretched endlessly in both directions. "This is it," David said, shouldering his massive pack. "Adventure time." The forest swallowed us within 50 yards. Ancient cypress trees rose like cathedral columns, their knees jutting from black water that reflected our movements in perfect, still images. Spanish moss hung in curtains so thick that even though it was only 3 in the afternoon, the light had a perpetual twilight quality. The air smelled of decay and rich earth, with an underlying sweetness I couldn't identify. Our boots squelched in the muck as we followed what might have been an animal trail deeper into the preserve. David had his GPS unit, though he'd warned me the tree canopy might interfere with the signal. Within an hour, we'd lost any sense of the outside world. No road noise, no aircraft overhead, no evidence that humans had ever existed. "According to this," David said, checking his GPS, "our campsite should be about 2 miles ahead, on a hammock overlooking Turner River." But something was wrong with the GPS. The little arrow indicating our position kept jumping around, sometimes showing us moving backward even when we were clearly walking forward. David tapped the screen and muttered about satellite interference. "These things are useless under heavy canopy anyway," he said. "We'll navigate old school." The problem was, neither of us was particularly good at old school navigation. We had a topographic map, but the terrain all looked the same. Endless cypress swamp with occasional patches of higher ground covered in cabbage palms and live oaks. The map showed Turner River as a prominent blue line, but we couldn't hear any flowing water. By 5 o'clock, we still hadn't found the campsite. The light was fading fast under the canopy, and David was getting increasingly agitated. "It should be right here," he said, staring at the map. According to the GPS coordinates Relentless Tracker 87 gave me, we should be standing on a raised hammock with a clear view of the river. Instead, we were standing in knee-deep water, surrounded by cypress knees and increasingly aggressive mosquitoes. The sweetish smell I'd noticed earlier was getting stronger, more cloying. It reminded me of something, but I couldn't place what. "Let's just find any dry ground and set up camp," I suggested. "We can look for the proper site tomorrow." David reluctantly agreed. We slogged through the swamp for another 30 minutes before finding a small island of higher ground, maybe 40 feet across, covered with stunted palms and what looked like the remains of an old chickie hut. Just some rotted poles sticking up from the ground, but evidence that someone had camped here before. As we set up our tents, I noticed something odd about the chickie remains. The poles were arranged in a perfect circle, which wasn't typical of Seminole construction, and carved into several of the poles were symbols I didn't recognize. Not Seminole syllabary, not anything I'd ever seen. They looked almost burned into the wood rather than carved. "David, check this out," I called. But when I turned around, David was gone. I stood up slowly, my heart beginning to race. Our campsite was small enough that I could see every inch of it. Our tents were half erected. David's pack was sitting beside his tent, but David himself had simply vanished. "David," I called. "David, where are you?" My voice seemed to die in the thick air. No echo, no response. Just the sudden, absolute silence of the swamp. I waited, listening. Sometimes in deep wilderness, sound can be deceptive. Maybe he'd just stepped behind a tree to relieve himself, and my voice hadn't carried as far as I thought. But seconds stretched into minutes, and the silence only deepened. Then I heard his voice. "Michael, over here." It came from across the small clearing, from a direction where I could clearly see there was nothing but open water and cypress trees. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam across the darkness. "Where are you?" I called back. "Right here," the voice said, and it was definitely David's voice, but something was off about it. Too flat, too measured. David was usually animated, especially when he was excited about camping. This voice sounded like someone reading from a script. I followed the voice, stepping carefully through the shallow water around our island. My flashlight beam penetrated maybe 10 feet into the darkness before the cypress trunks and Spanish moss absorbed it completely. "David, I can't see you. Keep talking." "I'm right here, Michael." The voice came from directly in front of me, but my flashlight showed nothing but black water and tree trunks. I took another step forward, then another, the water getting deeper. Soon, I was waist deep, my flashlight held high to keep it dry. "David, this isn't funny. Where the hell are you?" "I'm right here." The voice was so close now it seemed to be coming from right beside my ear, but when I spun around, nothing was there. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I swept the flashlight beam in wide arcs but saw only endless repetition. Water, cypress knees, moss-draped branches. Then the light went out. I stood in absolute darkness, waist-deep in swamp water, surrounded by the sound of my own breathing and the gentle lapping of water against the trees. I pressed the flashlight's button repeatedly, but nothing happened. The batteries had been fresh when we started, and LED lights don't just burn out. "David!" I screamed. No response, but gradually my eyes began to adjust to the darkness, and I realized it wasn't completely dark after all. There was a faint luminescence in the water around me, just enough to make out shapes. Foxfire, probably, bioluminescent algae that sometimes appears in stagnant water. Except this light seemed to be moving with purpose, gathering into patterns that almost looked like... I thrashed back toward the island, no longer caring about making noise or maintaining my dignity. Behind me, I could swear I heard something large moving through the water, but when I looked back, there was only that strange, shifting glow. I hauled myself onto dry ground, gasping and shaking. My clothes were soaked, and I'd lost my flashlight somewhere in the water. David's pack was still beside his tent, exactly where he'd left it. I fumbled through it until I found his emergency flashlight, a heavy mag light that threw a reassuring cone of white light. "David," I called again, my voice cracking. "Please answer me." This time, I heard something. Not David's voice, but a sound like branches snapping, coming from the forest on the opposite side of our island. I aimed the flashlight toward the sound and saw movement. Something large disappearing behind a cluster of palms. I grabbed David's hiking boots from beside his pack. They were dry. Whatever had happened to him, he hadn't walked away from the campsite. That's when I noticed our tents. When I'd left to look for David, we'd been in the process of setting them up. His tent had been about half erected, mine not even started. Now, both tents were fully set up, guy lines taut, rain flies properly positioned. Someone had finished the job while I was stumbling around in the swamp. I called David's name again, but my voice came out as barely a whisper. I was starting to understand that something was very wrong here, something that had nothing to do with getting lost or equipment failure. I spent the next hour searching every inch of our small island with the flashlight, calling David's name until my throat was raw. The symbols carved into the old chicky poles seemed to shift and writhe in the moving beam of light, but that had to be my imagination. Fear playing tricks with perception. By 9 o'clock, I'd made a decision. I would wait until dawn, then hike back to the Jeep and drive for help. The Park Service would have trained search and rescue teams, people who knew this country and had proper equipment. I was just making things worse, stumbling around in the dark. I crawled into my tent and tried to sleep, but every sound made me jolt awake. The swamp at night is never quiet. There are always owls calling, alligators bellowing, the splash of fish jumping. But that night, the sounds seemed to form patterns that almost resembled human speech. Around midnight, I heard David's voice again. "Michael, I need help." I was outside my tent instantly, flashlight in hand. The voice had come from the water's edge, maybe 20 feet from where I'd been sleeping. "David, where are you?" I whispered. "I'm hurt, Michael. I can't move." I swept the flashlight across the water and saw him. David was standing chest deep in the swamp, about 30 feet from shore. His back was to me and he wasn't moving, just standing there in the black water like a statue. "David, what happened? How did you get out there?" He didn't answer, didn't even turn around. I waded into the water, moving as quickly as I could while trying to keep the flashlight dry. The bottom was soft muck that sucked at my boots with each step. As I got closer, I could see that David's clothes were torn, and there was something dark staining the water around him. "David, can you hear me? I'm coming." When I was about 10 feet away, he turned around. It was David's face, but wrong. The features were slightly too sharp, the proportions just off enough to fall into the uncanny valley that makes your brain scream warnings. His eyes reflected the flashlight beam like an animal's, and when he smiled, his teeth seemed too numerous, too pointed. "Hello, Michael," he said in David's voice. "Thank you for coming to get me." I stumbled backward, but the thing that looked like David moved toward me with impossible speed, gliding through the water without seeming to take steps. I turned and ran, crashing through the swamp in blind panic, branches tearing at my clothes and face. Behind me, I heard David's laugh, but distorted, echoing from multiple directions at once. I made it back to the island and dove into my tent, zipping it closed as if nylon could protect me from whatever was out there. I lay in my sleeping bag, clutching the flashlight, listening to sounds outside that might have been wind in the trees, or might have been something circling the campsite. The sounds stopped just before dawn. When gray light finally began filtering through the trees, I emerged from my tent to find David sitting beside the cold remains of our campfire, staring into the distance. He was wearing dry clothes and there was no sign of the injuries I'd seen in the water. "Morning, Mike," he said without looking at me. "Sleep well?" I stared at him, trying to process what I was seeing. This looked like David. The real David, not the wrong-faced thing from the water. Same clothes he'd been wearing yesterday. Same mannerisms, same voice. But something in his eyes was different. Flatter. Like he was looking at me from a great distance. "David, what happened last night? Where did you go?" He turned to look at me then, and for a moment his expression was completely blank. Then he smiled, and it was almost David's smile. "What do you mean? I've been here all night. You were the one acting strange, yelling and running around in the swamp. I figured you were having a nightmare. But you were gone. Your tent wasn't set up, and then it was. You were standing in the water, and your face... Mike, you're scaring me a little." David's voice carried just the right note of concerned confusion. "Are you feeling okay? Maybe you had some kind of reaction to the water or something. There's all kinds of bacteria in these swamps." I wanted to argue, to insist that what I'd experienced was real. But looking at David in the morning light, I began to doubt myself. Stress, darkness, unfamiliar surroundings. Maybe I had been hallucinating. Maybe the isolation was getting to me faster than I'd expected. Maybe you're right, I said. I didn't sleep well. Tell you what, David said, standing up and brushing off his pants. Let's break camp and head back early. This place is kind of creeping me out too. Something feels off about it. I felt a surge of relief. Yeah, let's get out of here. We packed quickly, but as we prepared to leave, I noticed that David kept forgetting things. Basic things. He packed his sleeping bag without removing it from the tent. He tried to put his wet boots in his pack without emptying the water out first. When I pointed these things out, he looked genuinely confused for a moment before correcting the mistake. Sorry, he said. I guess I'm more rattled than I thought. The hike back should have taken us 2 hours, but after 4 hours of walking, nothing looked familiar. The GPS was still malfunctioning, showing our position jumping randomly across the map. We should have reached the road by now, but instead we seemed to be deeper in the swamp than ever. This doesn't make sense, I said, checking the map for the dozenth time. We've been walking northeast, which should take us straight back to the Jeep. David was standing a few feet away, staring up at the sky through the canopy. Michael, he said slowly, what time do you think it is? I checked my watch. Almost 2 in the afternoon. Why? Look at the shadows. I looked around and felt my stomach drop. The shadows were all wrong. Based on the position of the few patches of sunlight filtering through the trees, the sun appeared to be in the same position it had been when we'd started hiking that morning. As if time had stopped, or we'd been walking in circles for hours without realizing it. That's impossible, I said. David turned to look at me, and for just a moment, his face was that wrong face from the night before. Too sharp, too angular, with those reflecting eyes. Then it was David again, looking confused and frightened. Mike, I think we're lost. We were more than lost. We were trapped in something that didn't follow normal rules. We kept walking, trying different directions, but the result was always the same. No matter which way we went, we never seemed to get closer to anything resembling civilization. The sun never moved. The shadows never shifted. And David kept forgetting things. What's my sister's name? I asked him during one of our rest stops. He stared at me blankly for several seconds before answering. Jenny. It was Sarah. David had been my best friend for 8 years, had been Sarah's date to my birthday party last month, and he'd called her Jenny. David, what's my middle name? Another blank stare. Why are you testing me? Mike? What's the name of our company? Braxton. Braxton Engineering. It was Blackstone Engineering. We'd worked there together for 3 years. I started walking faster, not caring if David kept up. Whatever was wearing my friend's face was becoming a worse approximation by the hour, losing details, forgetting things that the real David would never forget. And with each incorrect answer, its features seemed to shift slightly, becoming less human and more like something trying to remember how to be human. The thing that looked like David followed me, maintaining the same distance, occasionally calling my name in David's voice, but I noticed it never spoke unless I was looking at it directly. When I glanced back over my shoulder, it was always perfectly positioned, as if it had just stopped moving the instant I turned around. As the sun that wouldn't move began to set, somehow it was getting dark even though time had stopped, I realized we were back at our original campsite. The same island, the same rotted chickee poles, the same arrangement of cypress trees. We'd been walking in a perfect circle all day, somehow ending up exactly where we'd started. The thing wearing David's face smiled. Looks like we're camping here again tonight. I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. But there, the swamp stretched endlessly in every direction, and I was beginning to understand that the rules that governed this place were not the rules of the normal world. Distance meant nothing here. Direction meant nothing. Only the island existed, and whatever lived on it. That night, I didn't pretend to sleep. I sat outside my tent with David's flashlight watching the thing that had taken my friend's place. It sat on the opposite side of the dead campfire, motionless as a mannequin, staring at me with those reflective eyes. Around midnight, it began to change. The process was gradual, like watching a time-lapse video of decay. David's features began to sag and blur, as if they were made of wax melting under heat. The skin took on a grayish pallor, and dark veins became visible beneath the surface. Its clothes began to look wet and stained, as if it had been pulled from the bottom of the swamp. But the worst part was that it kept talking in David's voice, even as its face became something from a nightmare. "Mike, you're staring at me. It's making me uncomfortable." The voice was still perfectly David's, coming from a mouth that was no longer quite human-shaped. "Mike, why aren't you talking to me? Did I do something wrong?" I couldn't answer. My throat had closed up with terror. I could only sit there, flashlight trained on the thing, watching it slowly transform into something that belonged in the deepest, darkest part of human mythology. By dawn, it had stopped pretending to be David entirely. The creature sitting across from me was tall and impossibly thin, with skin like bark and fingers that ended in black claws. Its face was a crude approximation of human features, as if someone had tried to carve a person's face from memory and gotten the proportions wrong. But the worst part was its eyes. They were David's eyes, unchanged, staring at me from that alien face. "Hello, Michael," it said in David's voice. "Thank you for keeping me company." I forced myself to speak. "What did you do with David?" The creature tilted its head and I heard vertebrae crack. "David is here. David is me. I am David now." "No, you're not. You're something else. Something that took his shape." "Shape is temporary," the creature said. "I have worn many shapes. I wore the shape of the Seminole who built this place. I wore the shape of the white hunters who came after. I wore the shape of the park rangers who tried to map this area. Now I wear David's shape." "What are you?" "I am what remains when the old places are forgotten. When the maps stop showing the paths and the stories stop being told, something must guard the threshold. Something must ensure that some places remain unchanged." The creature stood up, and as it did, it began to shift again. For a moment, it looked like an elderly Seminole man in traditional dress, then a park ranger in a faded uniform, then a hunter in clothes from the 1920s. Finally, it settled back into its crude approximation of David. "This place does not exist on your maps because it cannot exist on your maps," it continued. "It is between things, between the world you know and the world that was. I am its guardian." "I just want to leave," I said. "I just want to go home." "But you are home now," the creature said and smiled with David's mouth. "You came here looking for untouched wilderness, for a place where humans had never left their mark. You found it. This is where the old Florida still exists, where time moves differently, where the rules of your world hold no power." I looked around at the endless swamp, the black water, the moss-draped trees that all looked exactly the same. "How long have I been here?" "Time has no meaning here. You have been here forever. You have been here for no time at all. You arrived yesterday. You have never left." The creature moved closer, and I could smell it now, the sweet, cloying scent I'd noticed when we first entered the swamp. It was the smell of decay, of things that should be dead but weren't, of organic matter breaking down and rebuilding itself in wrong ways. "Your friend understood, eventually," it said. "He fought at first when I began to take his memories, his shape, his voice, but in the end, he welcomed the change. It is peaceful, becoming part of something eternal. Where is he? Where is the real David?" The creature gestured toward the water surrounding our island. "He is here, in the water, in the trees, in the air itself. He is part of this place now, as you will be." I stood up slowly, backing toward the edge of the island. No. I'm leaving. I'm walking out of here and I'm not stopping until I find the road." "You have already tried that," the creature said patiently. "Yesterday, and the day before that, and the day before that. You have tried to leave many times, Michael. You always come back here. You always end up exactly where you started." It was lying. It had to be lying. But even as I thought that, I had a sudden, terrible doubt. How many times had we packed up and tried to hike out? How many times had we ended up back at this island? The memories were blurring together, becoming uncertain. "This is the first time," I said, but my voice sounded weak even to me. "Is it?" the creature asked. "What day is it, Michael? What month? How long have you been here?" I tried to remember, but the memories felt slippery, uncertain. We'd come on a Friday, I was sure of that. But which Friday? And what day was it now? "It doesn't matter," I said and stepped into the water. The creature didn't try to stop me. It just watched as I waded toward the tree line, that horrible smile never leaving David's face. I walked for what felt like hours, pushing deeper into the swamp, determined not to turn back no matter what. The water got deeper, reaching my chest, but I kept going. I had to get away from that thing, had to find some way back to the real world. But gradually I began to notice familiar landmarks. A cypress tree with a distinctive lightning scar. A cluster of bromeliads growing in a particular pattern. A fallen log that I was certain I'd seen before. And then, impossibly, I was back at the island. The creature was still sitting where I'd left it, still wearing David's face, still smiling. "Welcome back," it said. I tried again, and again. Each time I ended up back at the island, no matter which direction I went or how far I walked. The swamp was like a maze with only one room, or a loop that always led back to the beginning. On my fourth attempt, I found something in the water. It was partially buried in the muck at the bottom of the swamp, but when I pulled it free, I recognized it immediately. David's wallet, the leather stained black and swollen with water. Inside, his driver's license was still visible, though the photo had faded to an unrecognizable blur. I kept digging in the muck and found more things. David's watch, stopped at 3:17, his pocket knife, the blade corroded beyond use, a fragment of his shirt, torn and tangled with aquatic weeds. These were David's real possessions. Whatever was sitting on the island wearing his face, it wasn't David. David was here, at the bottom of the swamp, and had been for some time. I waded back to the island with growing rage. The creature looked up as I approached, still wearing that peaceful, patient expression. "You killed him," I said. "Death is a concept from your world," the creature replied. "It has no meaning here. David simply changed form. As you will." "No." I pulled David's knife from my pocket, working the corroded blade free from its handle. "I'm getting out of here, and I'm taking you with me." The creature laughed, and the sound was like wind through dead leaves. "You cannot kill what was never alive, Michael. You cannot leave what you have never entered. This place exists outside your reality. I am part of it, and now, so are you." I lunged at it with the knife, but the blade passed through its body like smoke. The creature didn't even flinch. "Anger is useless here," it said. "Acceptance is easier." But I had noticed something when the knife passed through it. For just a moment, the creature had flickered, becoming translucent. And behind it, carved into one of the old chicky poles, I'd seen something that hadn't been there before. David's name, scratched into the wood as if with his fingernails. I circled the island, examining each of the poles more carefully. They were covered with names, dozens of them, carved or scratched into the rotting wood. Some looked recent, others had been weathered almost smooth by time. All of them were names of people who had found this place and never left. Relentless, Tracker 87. That was carved near the base of one pole, along with what looked like a real name, Marcus Chen. The hiker who had told David about this place had been trapped here too, and God knew how long ago. But there was something else carved into the poles. Symbols that looked almost like letters, but not from any alphabet I recognized. They were arranged in patterns around each name, and as I studied them, I began to see that they weren't random. They were instructions, or maybe warnings. The symbols near David's name were fresh, still bleeding sap from the wood, and as I traced them with my finger, I felt something shift around me, like reality hiccuping. The creature behind me made a sound that might have been distress. "Do not touch those," it said, and for the first time, its voice carried something other than calm patience. I pressed my finger harder against the symbols, and the world around me wavered like heat shimmer. For just a moment, I could see through the illusion that surrounded this place. The island wasn't an island at all. It was a massive tree stump, ancient beyond measurement, rotting in the center of a perfectly circular pool. And the creature wasn't sitting across from me. It was part of the stump itself, a growth that had taken human shape, fed by the remains of everyone who had ever been trapped here. "You see," the creature said, and now its voice was desperate. "You begin to understand. But understanding changes nothing. You cannot unmake what has been made. You cannot escape what has been chosen for you." But I was beginning to think that maybe I could. The symbols weren't just names and warnings. They were a record, left by people who had been trapped here long enough to figure out how this place worked, and some of them, the most recent ones, looked like instructions. I found what I was looking for carved near the base of the central pole. A series of symbols that seemed to pulse with their own light, and next to them, scratched in shaky English letters, "Break the circle at dawn. Face the water. Speak the names." I looked up at the sky. False dawn was already beginning to lighten the canopy, and I could feel something changing in the air around me. The oppressive stillness that had held this place in its grip was starting to waver. The creature had stood up, and its calm demeanor was cracking. "Michael, you do not understand what you are doing. This place is older than your civilization, older than your species. It serves a purpose beyond your comprehension." "Maybe," I said, positioning myself at the water's edge, facing away from the island. "But I don't care about its purpose. I just want to go home." I began to read the names carved into the poles, all of them, starting with the oldest and working my way to the most recent. Names of Seminole who had stumbled into this trap. Names of settlers and hunters and rangers and hikers, people who had come here looking for something and found more than they bargained for. With each name I spoke, the world around me became a little less solid. The creature behind me was making sounds now that were no longer remotely human, sounds like breaking wood and rushing water. "Marcus Chen," I said, reading the name that had been carved next to Relentless Tracker 87. "David Jones." The instant I spoke David's name, something shifted. The illusion that had held this place together for centuries began to crack, and through the cracks, I could see the real world bleeding through. Dawn light, real dawn light, struck the water in front of me, and in that light, I could see a path, not through the swamp, but through the illusion itself, a narrow channel of reality that led away from this trapped place and back to the world where time moved forward and maps made sense. Behind me, the creature let out a sound like a tree falling. When I turned to look, it was no longer wearing David's face. It was just roots and bark and moss, a growth that had learned to mimic human form but was falling apart now that its power was broken. And scattered around the rotting stump, I could see bones. Human bones. Some old enough to have turned brown with age, others still white and fresh. David's bones were among them, I was sure, though I couldn't tell which ones were his. I wanted to collect them, to give my friend a proper burial, but the path of reality was already beginning to fade as the sun rose higher. I had maybe minutes before this place trapped me again, before the illusion reasserted itself and made escape impossible. I ran. The path led me through impossible geography, over solid ground that had been underwater moments before, past trees that flickered between living cypress and dead stumps, through air that tasted of both swamp water and pine needles. Reality and illusion blurred together, but I kept running toward the growing light ahead, and then I was standing beside David's Jeep, gasping and shaking, my clothes soaked with swamp water and my hands cut from pushing through branches that might or might not have been real. The Jeep started on the first try. I drove back toward civilization without looking in the rearview mirror, afraid that I might see moss-draped trees instead of the pine flatwoods that should have been there. It wasn't until I reached the interstate that I finally believed I'd escaped. The Park Service found David's body 3 days later, after I led them to the area where we'd gone missing. He was discovered in a deep pool about a mile from where I'd left the Jeep, apparently drowned. The official report stated that he'd become disoriented in the dark, fallen into the water, and been unable to find his way out. They never found the island with the chicky poles. When I led them back to look for it, we found only ordinary swamp, no different from thousands of other acres in Big Cypress. The pool where they found David's body was just a pool, with no ancient stumps or carved symbols. But I know what I saw. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear David's voice calling my name from across impossible distances. I've never gone camping again, and I've made sure that the hiking forum where Relentless Tracker 87 posted his recommendations about that pristine wilderness area has been taken down permanently. Some places should stay lost. Some places should never be found. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the Big Cypress National Preserve, deep in the heart of Florida's most unforgiving wilderness. Sarah and I had been planning this trip for months. We needed to get away from everything: the city, the stress, the constant buzz of our phones. Sarah had found this remote camping spot on some obscure hiking forum, miles from the nearest road, accessible only by a narrow trail that wound through ancient cypress groves and sawgrass prairies. The post described it as untouched by civilization, which sounded perfect to us. "Are you sure about this place?" I asked Sarah as we loaded our backpacks into the Jeep that October morning. The weather forecast called for clear skies, but something about the thick, humid air felt wrong, like the atmosphere itself was holding its breath. Sarah adjusted her auburn hair under her hiking cap and smiled that infectious grin that had made me fall in love with her 3 years ago. "Trust me, Mike. Sometimes you have to go where the maps end to find what you're really looking for." I should have listened to that voice in my head, the one that whispered warnings I couldn't quite understand. But Sarah had a way of making adventure seem like the only logical choice, and I loved her for it. The drive to the trailhead took us deeper into Florida than I'd ever been. We passed through small towns with names like Ochapi and Chokoloskee, places that seemed to exist in a different time. The landscape gradually shifted from suburban sprawl to something wilder, more primal. Spanish moss hung from the trees like funeral shrouds, and the water in the roadside canals was the color of strong tea. "According to the GPS, we should reach the trailhead in about 20 minutes, Sarah said, studying her phone. But as we drove deeper into the preserve, the signal bars disappeared one by one until her screen showed nothing but no service. "That's weird," she muttered. "I had full bars just a minute ago." I glanced at my own phone. Same thing. "Must be the remote location," I said, though something cold settled in my stomach. The trailhead was marked by nothing more than a small wooden post with a faded trail marker. No parking lot, no facilities, just a narrow dirt path disappearing into a wall of vegetation so thick it blocked out most of the afternoon sun. We shouldered our packs and checked our gear one final time. "Ready for an adventure?" Sarah asked, her eyes bright with excitement. "Always," I replied, though the word felt heavy in my mouth. The trail was harder than either of us had anticipated. What the forum post had described as a moderate hike turned out to be a grueling march through knee-deep swamp water, over fallen logs slick with algae, and through walls of saw palmetto that left our arms covered in thin, stinging cuts. The air was thick with mosquitoes and something else, a smell like rotting vegetation mixed with something sharper, more metallic. "God, what is that stench?" Sarah asked, pulling her shirt up over her nose. "Probably just swamp gas," I said. But I didn't believe it. The smell had an organic quality that made my skin crawl, like something large had died and been left to decompose in the humid air. We'd been hiking for nearly 4 hours when we finally reached the campsite. It was exactly as described, a small clearing on slightly higher ground, surrounded by massive cypress trees whose trunks disappeared into the gathering dusk above us. Spanish moss hung from every branch like tattered curtains, and the ground was carpeted with a thick layer of decomposing leaves that squelched under our boots. "This is perfect," Sarah said, dropping her pack and stretching her arms toward the darkening sky. "Look at those trees. Some of them must be hundreds of years old." I nodded, but something about the place felt wrong. The silence was too complete, too absolute. In all our camping trips, there had always been sounds: birds, insects, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Here, there was nothing. Even the mosquitoes that had plagued us on the trail seemed to have vanished. We set up camp quickly, wanting to get our tent erected before full darkness fell. The sun was dropping fast, and under the canopy of ancient trees, night came early and absolute. By the time we had our camp established, the darkness was so complete I couldn't see my hand in front of my face without a flashlight. "I've never seen it get this dark," Sarah said, her voice smaller than usual. She was standing near our fire ring, trying to get the kindling to catch. But something was wrong with the fire, too. The wood we'd brought was dry, and I'd used plenty of fire starter, but the flames kept guttering out, as if the air itself was smothering them. "Here, let me try," I said, taking the lighter from her. But no matter what I did, the fire would start to catch, burn for a few seconds, then die. The flames seemed to writhe and twist in ways that defied the still air, turning colors I'd never seen in a campfire, deep purples and sickly greens that made my eyes water. "That's not normal," Sarah whispered. Finally, after nearly an hour of trying, we managed to get a small, fitful fire going. It cast weird shadows that seemed to move independently of the flames, and the light barely penetrated the oppressive darkness around us. We huddled close together, eating cold sandwiches and trying to pretend everything was normal. "Tell me about your day," Sarah said, the way she always did when she was nervous. It was our ritual, sharing the details of ordinary life as a way to create normalcy. "Well, I got up at 6:30, I began. But my voice sounded strange in the absolute quiet. Had coffee and checked my emails. I trailed off. Something was moving in the darkness beyond our fire. Not the movement of wind in the trees, there was no wind, but something deliberate, purposeful. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered. I strained my ears, but heard nothing. "Hear what?" It sounded like someone calling my name. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. "You're probably just tired. It's been a long day." But even as I said it, I heard it too. Faint, almost at the edge of perception, a voice drifting through the trees. It sounded like Sarah's name, but stretched out, distorted, as if the darkness itself was learning to speak. "Sarah." The voice was coming from the east, where the trail disappeared into the black wall of cypress trees. Sarah started to stand, her face pale in the firelight. "Don't," I said quickly, grabbing her arm. "Don't go toward it." "But what if someone needs help? What if there's another camper out there?" I shook my head. No one else would be out here, and that doesn't sound like someone calling for help. It sounds like... I couldn't finish the sentence. It sounds like something trying to lure you away. We sat in tense silence for the next hour, feeding small sticks to our reluctant fire and listening to the darkness. The voice came again twice more, each time from a different direction, as if whatever was making it was circling our camp. And each time, it sounded more like Sarah, as if something was learning her voice, practicing it. "We should go into the tent," Sarah said finally. "Maybe we'll feel better in the morning." I nodded, though I doubted either of us would sleep. We banked the fire and retreated into our small nylon shelter, zipping the flaps tight as if that thin barrier could protect us from whatever was out there. Sarah curled against me, and I could feel her trembling. "Mike, I'm scared." "It's okay," I whispered, though it wasn't. "It's probably just some kind of echo effect. Sound travels strangely in places like this." But I didn't believe my own words. The voice had been too perfect, too deliberate. And there was something else bothering me, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The smell was getting stronger, that sick sweet odor of decay, and it seemed to be coming from inside our tent. I must have dozed off because I was awakened by the sound of the tent zipper. In the absolute darkness, I couldn't see anything, but I could hear the metallic rasp of the zipper being slowly, quietly opened. "Sarah?" I whispered. "Are you going to the bathroom?" No answer. I reached out to where she should have been lying next to me, but my hand found only empty sleeping bag. The fabric was still warm, but Sarah was gone. Panic flooded through me. I fumbled for my flashlight and clicked it on, the sudden beam of light blinding after hours of darkness. The tent was empty except for me. The zipper was open about 2 feet, just enough for a person to slip out. "Sarah," I called, scrambling out of the tent. "Sarah, where are you?" My voice echoed strangely in the darkness, bouncing off the trees in a way that made it sound like multiple people calling her name. I swept my flashlight beam around the campsite, but the light seemed weak, absorbed by the darkness like water into a sponge. The fire had died to cold ashes, though I was sure we'd banked it properly. And there, in the soft earth around our camp, I could see footprints. Sarah's hiking boots, heading east toward the trail. But there was something wrong with the prints. They were too deep, as if she'd been carrying something heavy, or as if something had been carrying her. I grabbed my larger flashlight and the emergency whistle from my pack and followed the trail. Sarah, please answer me." The footprints led away from camp, following what looked like a game trail that branched off from the main hiking path. I'd never seen this trail during our hike in. It was as if it had appeared overnight. The prints were clear in the soft earth for the first 100 yards, then they simply stopped. Not stopped as in she'd reached solid ground. Stopped as in she'd vanished into thin air. I stood there in the darkness, my flashlight beam dancing frantically across the ground, looking for any sign of where she might have gone. That's when I heard it. "Mike." My blood turned to ice. It was Sarah's voice, but it was coming from above me, from somewhere high in the canopy of the ancient cypress. I tilted my flashlight upward, but the beam couldn't penetrate the thick mesh of branches and Spanish moss. "Mike, help me." The voice was definitely Sarah's, but there was something wrong with it. The cadence was off, like someone reciting lines they'd memorized but didn't understand. And underneath her words, I could hear something else, a low, rhythmic clicking, like the sound of large insects or teeth. "Sarah, where are you? How did you get up there?" "Mike, come up. Come find me." I looked around frantically for a way to climb, but the massive cypress trunks were smooth and branchless for the first 30 feet. There was no way Sarah could have climbed up there, not without equipment we didn't have. "Sarah, come down. I can't reach you." The clicking sound got louder, more insistent. And then I heard something that made me stagger backward in horror. It was Sarah's laugh, but wrong, too long, too hollow, with an underlying hiss that no human throat could make. I ran. I'm not proud of it, but I ran back toward our camp as fast as my legs could carry me, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I crashed through the undergrowth. Behind me, Sarah's voice called my name over and over, but each repetition sounded less human, more like an echo of an echo, distorted by something that didn't understand what it was mimicking. I reached our campsite and immediately began stuffing everything into our packs. Whatever was out there, it wasn't Sarah. Sarah was gone, and something else was wearing her voice like a mask. But as I rolled up our sleeping bags, I heard footsteps approaching from the same direction I'd just come from. Slow, measured footsteps on the forest floor. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the sound. Sarah emerged from the darkness at the edge of our campsite, walking normally, smiling that familiar smile I loved so much. "Hey, where did you go?" she asked, her voice perfectly normal now. "I woke up and you were gone." I stared at her, my heart hammering in my chest. "Sarah? Where were you? I followed your footprints into the woods. I heard you calling from the trees." She looked puzzled. "What are you talking about?" "I just went to pee. I've been gone maybe 5 minutes." She gestured toward a cluster of palmetto bushes about 50 yards from our camp. "I went over there for some privacy." I looked at her, then at the bushes she was pointing to, then back at her. The timeline didn't make sense. I'd been searching for her for at least an hour, and the footprints I'd followed led in the complete opposite direction. "Sarah, what time is it?" She checked her watch. "About 2:30. Why?" That was impossible. When I'd first woken up and found her gone, it had been just after midnight. But looking at my own watch, she was right. Somehow, I'd lost 2.5 hours. "Mike, you're scaring me. What's wrong?" I studied her face in the flashlight beam. Everything looked normal. Her freckles, the small scar on her chin from a childhood accident, her green eyes. But something felt wrong. She was standing too still, barely blinking, and her smile seemed to be frozen in place. "How did you find your way back in the dark?" I asked carefully. "I just followed my own footprints," she said, that same fixed smile never wavering. "Same way you did." But I'd checked those bushes when I was searching for her. There were no footprints leading to or from them. The ground there was hard-packed earth that wouldn't show tracks. "Sarah, tell me something only you would know." Her head tilted slightly like a bird studying an insect. "What do you mean?" "Tell me about our first date. Where did we go?" "We went to a restaurant," she said after a long pause. "It was nice. We had food." My blood ran cold. Sarah remembered everything about our first date. How I'd been so nervous I'd spilled wine on my shirt. How she'd laughed and said it looked like a map of Italy. How we'd talked until the restaurant closed around us. She would never describe it so vaguely. "What's my middle name?" I asked. Another pause. "I don't remember. It's been a long day." Sarah knew my middle name was James. She'd teased me about it being boring just yesterday. The thing wearing Sarah's face kept smiling, but now I could see something wrong with her eyes. They didn't reflect the flashlight beam the way human eyes should. Instead, they absorbed the light, like looking into deep water. "Who are you?" I whispered. The smile never wavered. "I'm Sarah, your girlfriend, the woman you love." But as she spoke, I could hear that clicking sound again, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere inside her throat. And her scent was wrong, too. Instead of her usual perfume mixed with camping sweat, she smelled like that rotting vegetation odor that had been plaguing us since we arrived. "Where is she?" I demanded, my voice rising. "What did you do with Sarah?" The thing that looked like Sarah tilted its head further, an unnatural angle that would have broken a human neck. "Sarah is here," it said, and now its voice was starting to change, becoming flatter, more monotone. "Sarah is safe. Sarah is with us now." I backed away, my flashlight beam shaking. "With who? With what?" The smile finally began to fade, revealing something underneath that made my sanity recoil. Its teeth were wrong. Too many of them, arranged in rows like a shark's, and they were moving, shifting positions with wet, clicking sounds. The thing that had been pretending to be Sarah opened its mouth wider than any human mouth could open, and I could see down its throat to where something pale and writhing was coiled in the darkness. "She screamed for you," it said in a voice that was no longer even trying to sound human. "She called your name as we took her, but you didn't come. You didn't save her." I turned and ran into the darkness, crashing through the undergrowth without any thought of direction. Behind me, I could hear the thing that had worn Sarah's face giving chase, but it was no longer bothering to walk upright. The sounds it made as it moved were like breaking branches and tearing flesh, accompanied by that terrible clicking and a new sound, a low, mournful howling that seemed to come from multiple throats at once. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, finally collapsing against the massive trunk of a cypress tree. I could hear the thing hunting for me in the darkness, calling my name in voices I recognized. Sarah's voice, my mother's voice, my brother's voice, all twisted and wrong. That's when I realized the horrible truth. This thing, whatever it was, collected voices the way other predators collected trophies. And somewhere in the darkness of the big cypress preserve, Sarah was being forced to teach it how to be her, how to sound like her, how to lure the people she loved to their deaths. I forced myself to think rationally. I had to get out of here, had to get help, had to find a way to save Sarah if she was still alive. But first, I had to survive the night. I waited in absolute silence for what felt like hours, listening to the thing hunt for me. Sometimes it sounded close, sometimes far away, but it never stopped calling my name in the voices of people I loved. When the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the canopy, the voices finally stopped. I made my way back toward where I thought our campsite was, moving as quietly as possible. But when I found it, everything was wrong. Our tent was still there, but it was partially collapsed and torn, as if something with claws had shredded it. Our supplies were scattered and spoiled. The food containers were empty but had been refilled with a black, viscous substance that reeked of decay. And written in the dirt around our campsite, in letters 3 feet tall, was a message. She tastes like memories. I grabbed what supplies I could salvage and ran for the trail, following our original path back toward the parking area. But even that was wrong now. The trail that had taken us 4 hours to hike seemed to stretch on forever, looping back on itself in impossible ways. Every time I thought I was making progress, I'd recognize a landmark I'd passed hours before. The sun was directly overhead when I finally admitted the truth. I was lost. Not just lost, but trapped in something that wasn't quite our world anymore. The thing in the darkness had changed the rules, bent reality around itself like a spider's web. That's when I heard Sarah's voice again, but this time it was different. Weak, terrified, and definitely human. "Mike! Oh God, Mike, please help me!" I followed the sound, pushing through a wall of saw palmetto that opened onto a small clearing I'd never seen before. In the center of the clearing was what looked like a hunting blind, but wrong, built from cypress branches and Spanish moss, but held together with something that looked disturbingly organic. "Mike, I'm in here. It's trapped me in here." Sarah's voice was coming from inside the blind. I could see movement through gaps in the walls, the flash of her red hiking shirt. "Sarah, I'm coming." But as I got closer, something made me stop. The smell was overwhelming here, that rotting vegetation odor mixed with something worse, something that reminded me of a slaughterhouse. And there were bones scattered around the blind, some old and weathered, others fresh enough that I could see traces of flesh still clinging to them. "Mike, please hurry, it's coming back." I crept closer, my flashlight raised despite the daylight. Through a gap in the walls, I could see Sarah huddled in the corner of the blind, her face streaked with tears and dirt. She looked real, looked human, looked like the woman I loved, but her feet were pointing the wrong way. I stumbled backward, bile rising in my throat. Whatever was in that blind might look like Sarah from the chest up, but from behind I could see the truth. Its legs were jointed like a spider's, ending in curved talons that dug into the earth. And there were more than 2 of them. "Mike?" the thing that looked like Sarah called. "Why did you stop? I'm right here. Come save me." I ran again, crashing through the undergrowth in blind panic. Behind me, I could hear the thing abandoning its pretense, the blind exploding outward as something large and wrong emerged from it. The sound it made was like breaking bones and tearing meat, punctuated by that horrible clicking. I ran until I couldn't run anymore, until my vision started to gray at the edges and my legs buckled beneath me. I collapsed beside a stagnant pool of water, gasping and retching. The water was black as ink and smelled like sulfur, but I was so dehydrated I almost didn't care. As I knelt there trying to catch my breath, I saw something floating just beneath the surface of the water. Something pale and small, like a discarded piece of clothing. It was Sarah's hiking sock, the one with the hole in the toe that she'd been meaning to throw away for months. That's when I knew for certain that Sarah was dead. Whatever that thing was, it had killed her and was now using her appearance, her voice, even her memories to hunt me. The sock floating in that black water was all that was left of the woman I loved. I don't remember much of what happened next. I think I screamed. I think I clawed at the ground until my fingernails broke. I think I may have tried to drown myself in that sulfurous pool rather than face what was hunting me. But eventually, some survival instinct kicked in. I had to get out of here. I had to warn people. I had to make sure this thing never made it out of the preserve to hunt others. I forced myself to think logically about the layout of the preserve. The thing might be able to manipulate the trails, but it couldn't change the fundamental geography. If I could find water flowing in one direction, I could follow it toward the coast. All the waterways in this part of Florida eventually led to the Gulf of Mexico. I found a narrow creek and began following it downstream, moving as quietly as I could. The water was the same black color as the pool, but it was moving, which meant it had to lead somewhere. I walked for hours, stopping frequently to listen for sounds of pursuit. As the afternoon wore on, I began to hear something new, the distant sound of traffic. Real traffic, on a real road, in the real world where things like this couldn't exist. I pushed through a final wall of vegetation and emerged onto the shoulder of Highway 41, the main road that cuts through the preserve. I'd never been so happy to see asphalt and concrete in my life. A state trooper found me there 20 minutes later, collapsed in the middle of the road, babbling about monsters and missing girlfriends. I spent the next 3 days in a hospital in Naples, being treated for dehydration, exhaustion, and what the doctors politely called acute stress reaction. The search and rescue teams never found Sarah. They found our campsite, or what was left of it, but there was no sign of her. The official report listed her as missing, presumed dead, the victim of an animal attack or an accident in the treacherous swampland. They never found the blind made of bones and Spanish moss. They never found the black pool with its floating sock. They never found any evidence of the thing that had killed her. I tried to tell them what really happened, but of course no one believed me. How could they? I barely believed it myself, and I'd lived through it. But I know the truth. Sarah is gone, consumed by something that should not exist, something that wears the faces and voices of its victims like trophies. And somewhere in the darkness of the Big Cypress Preserve, it's still hunting, still learning, still collecting new voices to add to its repertoire. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear Sarah calling my name, but I know it's not really her. It's just the thing that ate her, practicing her voice, waiting for me to come back to the place where the maps end and the real world gives way to something older and infinitely more hungry. The doctors say the nightmares will fade with time, that the human mind can't hold on to trauma indefinitely. But they're wrong. Some things are too horrible to forget, too real to dismiss as delusion. I know what's waiting in the darkness of the preserve, and I know it's still wearing Sarah's face, still learning to be her, still hungry for more. I've moved 3 times since then, changed my phone number, deleted all my social media accounts. But it doesn't matter. Sometimes I catch a glimpse of red hair in a crowd or hear a laugh that sounds too familiar. Sometimes my phone rings in the middle of the night, and when I answer, there's nothing but the sound of clicking and the distant whisper of my name. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote backwaters of Big Cypress National Preserve, Florida, 3 miles southeast of the Oasis Visitor Center, where the cypress swamps give way to sawgrass prairies, and the only sounds are the splash of alligators and the rustle of things unseen. Sarah and I had been planning this trip for months. She was a nature photographer for Florida Wildlife magazine, and I was a software engineer desperately needing to disconnect from screens and code. We'd been together for 2 years, and this was supposed to be our romantic getaway. 3 days of backcountry camping in one of Florida's most pristine wildernesses. The plan was simple. Hike the Turner River Trail to a remote campsite Sarah had scouted on Google Earth. A small hammock of higher ground surrounded by sawgrass and cypress stands. No other campers, no facilities, just us and the wilderness. She wanted to photograph the rare ghost orchids that bloomed in the area, and I wanted to fish the quiet backwaters for largemouth bass. We parked at the trailhead on Loop Road, that lonely stretch of gravel that cuts through the heart of Big Cypress. The October heat was still oppressive, hanging over the swamp like a wet blanket. Sarah shouldered her camera pack with its expensive lenses, while I carried our tent, food, and camping gear. The weight felt good on my shoulders, honest, physical work after months of hunching over keyboards. The trail started on a raised boardwalk, but within a mile it descended into muddy paths that wound between massive bald cypresses draped in Spanish moss. The canopy closed overhead, filtering the sunlight into shifting patterns of green and gold. Sarah stopped frequently to photograph, her excitement infectious as she pointed out different species of birds and plants. "Look at that," she whispered, focusing her telephoto lens on something in the distance. "I think it's a barred owl, but the coloring is all wrong." I squinted where she was pointing but saw only shadows and moss. "Maybe it's just the light." She lowered her camera, frowning. "Maybe, but I've never seen markings like that before." We hiked deeper into the preserve, following game trails when the official path disappeared into standing water. The landscape grew stranger as we went. Cypress knees jutted from black water like gnarled fingers, and the Spanish moss hung so thick it formed curtains that we had to push through. The air smelled of decay and stagnant water, but underneath was something else, something that made my sinuses burn. By late afternoon, we reached our intended campsite. It was perfect. A small island of dry ground about 50 feet across, surrounded by shallow water and sawgrass. Ancient cypresses formed a rough circle around the perimeter, their massive trunks like cathedral pillars. Sarah immediately began setting up her camera equipment while I pitched our tent on the highest point of the hammock. "This is incredible," she breathed, snapping photos of the golden light filtering through the cypress canopy. "The magazine is going to love these shots." I was securing the rainfly when I noticed something odd about the trees. They were old, incredibly old, but arranged in an almost perfect circle around our campsite. Spanish moss draped from every branch, but it hung differently here, more like curtains or shrouds. And the smell I'd noticed earlier was stronger, a sweet, sick odor like flowers left too long in a vase. "Sarah," I called, but she was already wading into the shallow water, chasing the perfect shot of a great blue heron. As the sun began to set, the swamp came alive with sounds. Frogs chirped and croaked in a symphony that seemed almost orchestrated. Somewhere in the distance, an alligator bellowed, a sound that seemed to echo longer than it should. I started a fire in a ring of stones I found already arranged near the center of the hammock. Another oddity I didn't think much about at the time. Sarah returned as darkness fell, her pants soaked to the knees but her eyes bright with excitement. "I got some amazing shots," she said, connecting her camera to her laptop to review the images. "Wait, that's weird." "What?" She was frowning at her screen, scrolling through the photos. "This one I took of you setting up the tent. Look at the background." I leaned over her shoulder. The photo showed me struggling with tent stakes, but behind me, partially hidden by Spanish moss, was what looked like a face. Pale, elongated, with dark hollows where the eyes should be. "It's just pareidolia," I said, though my mouth felt dry. "You know, seeing faces in random patterns, like seeing shapes in clouds. Maybe, she said, but she kept staring at the image. But look at this one, and this one. She scrolled through several more photos. In each one, if you looked carefully at the background, there seemed to be figures watching from the moss-draped cypresses. Always just barely visible, always in the periphery. Camera malfunction? I suggested. Digital artifacts? I shoot in RAW format. These aren't compression artifacts. She enhanced one of the images, adjusting the exposure and contrast. The face became clearer, definitely humanoid, but wrong somehow. The proportions were off, the features too sharp. A branch snapped somewhere in the darkness beyond our fire's light. We both froze. Probably just an alligator, I whispered, but I was already reaching for the flashlight. The sound came again, closer this time. Not the heavy splash of a gator, but something more deliberate. Footsteps. Michael. Sarah's voice was tight with fear. My GPS isn't working. It shows us in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico. I pulled out my phone. No signal, which was expected, but the GPS was indeed showing impossible coordinates. According to the display, we were 30 miles offshore. Electronics glitch, I said, trying to sound confident. The swamp probably interferes with satellite signals. But even as I said it, I was remembering other small wrongnesses from the day. The way the trail seemed to shift when we weren't looking directly at it. How Sarah's photos showed things that hadn't been visible to the naked eye. The perfect circle of ancient cypresses around our campsite. We ate dinner in relative silence, the crackling fire our only light against the absolute darkness of the swamp. I'd been camping before, but I'd never experienced darkness like this. It was oppressive, almost tangible, pressing against the edges of our firelight like something alive. I keep feeling like we're being watched, Sarah whispered. I nodded. I felt it too, that prickle on the back of the neck, the sense of hidden eyes. Just our imagination. People aren't used to this kind of isolation anymore. But as I said it, I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, something pale slipping between the cypress trunks. When I turned to look directly, there was nothing there. We went to bed early, zipping ourselves into our sleeping bags inside the tent. The thin nylon walls felt inadequate against the darkness outside. Sarah curled against me and I could feel the tension in her body. "Tell me about your first camping trip," she whispered, trying to distract herself. I told her about going to the Rockies with my dad when I was 12, how scared I'd been of the mountain lions that never materialized, how safe I'd felt with my father's presence. The memory seemed to relax her, and eventually her breathing deepened into sleep. I lay awake, listening to the swamp sounds. The frogs had gone silent, which seemed ominous. The only sounds were the occasional splash of something large moving through the water and a rhythmic clicking that I couldn't identify. It almost sounded like teeth chattering. I must have dozed because I woke suddenly to complete silence. No frogs, no insects, no wind through the Spanish moss. Even the ever-present sound of water lapping against the hammock had stopped. The silence was so absolute it made my ears ring. Sarah was gone. Her sleeping bag was unzipped from the inside, lying open and empty beside me. The tent zipper was closed. I grabbed my flashlight and checked my watch. 3:17 a.m. "Sarah," I called softly, not wanting to wake whatever might be listening in the darkness. No response. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting just enough light to see a few feet in any direction. Beyond that was absolute blackness. "Sarah!" I called louder, my voice echoing strangely in the stillness. Something splashed in the distance, followed by what might have been laughter, or screaming. In the darkness and across the water it was impossible to tell. I built up the fire with our remaining wood, creating a beacon of light. Then I began a systematic search of the hammock, sweeping my flashlight beam in careful arcs. The island was small. It should have taken minutes to search completely. But somehow I kept finding areas I was sure I'd already checked, patches of ground that seemed different each time I illuminated them. That's when I found the footprints. They led from our tent to the edge of the hammock, where they disappeared into the dark water. But these weren't Sarah's prints. They were larger, with elongated toes that ended in what looked like claws. The depth of the impression suggested something much heavier than Sarah's 120-pound frame. And there was another set of prints leading away from the water's edge, smaller, human-sized, but with the same strange elongated toe structure. I called her name until my voice was hoarse, but the swamp swallowed my words without echo. As dawn approached, the normal sounds gradually returned. Frogs croaking, insects buzzing, the splash and bellow of alligators. But Sarah remained missing. I should have hiked out for help. That's what any rational person would have done. But something kept me rooted to that hammock. A certainty that Sarah was still out there, still alive, and that leaving would mean abandoning her forever. I spent the day conducting wider searches, wading through the chest-deep water in ever-expanding circles around our campsite. The cypress swamp seemed to go on forever, an endless maze of twisted trees and hanging moss. Several times I was sure I'd spotted her in the distance, a flash of red hair, the distinctive blue of her hiking shirt. But when I reached the location, there was nothing there. My cell phone died despite showing a full charge that morning. My backup GPS unit gave readings that were clearly impossible. Elevation changes of thousands of feet in terrain that was obviously flat, coordinates that placed me in different states entirely. As the second night approached, I was building up the fire when I heard her voice. "Michael?" I spun around, relief flooding through me. Sarah stood at the edge of the firelight, still wearing her hiking clothes. She looked unharmed, but different somehow. "Thank God," I breathed, starting toward her. "Where have you been? I've been looking everywhere." "I went to gather more wood," she said, which stopped me cold. We'd agreed never to venture away from camp alone, especially at night, and she was carrying no wood. "Sarah, you've been gone for 18 hours. You disappeared in the middle of the night." She stared at me blankly for a moment, then smiled. But it was wrong. Too wide, held too long. "Time moves differently here," she said. I studied her face in the firelight. It was definitely Sarah. Same green eyes, same spray of freckles across her nose, same small scar on her chin from a childhood accident. But something fundamental had changed. She blinked too infrequently. Her posture was subtly off, like someone wearing an unfamiliar costume. "Are you hurt?" I asked carefully. "No," she said, still smiling that unnatural smile. "I feel wonderful, better than ever." She moved closer to the fire, and I noticed she cast no shadow. In the dancing firelight, her form seemed solid enough, but there was no dark outline falling across the ground behind her. "What happened to you out there?" "I met them," she said, her voice dreamy. "The old ones. They've been waiting so long, Michael. So very long." Ice formed in my stomach despite the Florida heat. "Who did you meet?" Instead of answering, she began removing her clothes. This should have been arousing. Sarah was beautiful, and we'd been planning to make love under the stars on this trip. But there was something clinical about the way she moved, like she was following instructions rather than feeling desire. "Come to bed," she said, naked now in the firelight. Her skin seemed to glow with its own luminescence, and I could see strange marks covering her body. Symbols or scars that definitely hadn't been there before. "Sarah, what are those marks?" She looked down at herself as if noticing them for the first time. "Gifts," she said. "They marked me as theirs." I backed away from her, my hand instinctively reaching for the knife on my belt. "You're not, Sarah." Her smile never wavered. "Of course I am. Don't you recognize your girlfriend? Michael? Don't you love me anymore?" But her voice was changing as she spoke, becoming deeper, more resonant. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once rather than from her throat. "Prove it," I said. "Tell me something only Sarah would know." She tilted her head, considering. "We met at the coffee shop on Maple Street." You spilled latte on my laptop. It was true, but it was also information easily observed or overheard. What did you whisper to me on our first night together? The thing wearing Sarah's face stared at me for a long moment. Then it began to laugh, a sound like breaking glass and drowning screams. As it laughed, its form began to shift and change. The features remained recognizably Sarah's, but they stretched and distorted like clay being reshaped by invisible hands. She tasted like honey and fear, it said in a voice that was no longer even attempting to sound human. Sweet Sarah. She fought so hard at first, but in the end, she welcomed us inside. I ran. There was nowhere to go. We were on a small island surrounded by dark water and swamp, but pure terror drove me away from the fire and into the cypress grove. Spanish moss slapped my face as I crashed through the hanging curtains, my flashlight beam swinging wildly. Behind me, that thing that had been wearing Sarah's face gave chase, but it no longer bothered with human locomotion. I caught glimpses of it flowing between the trees like smoke, sometimes taking Sarah's form, sometimes appearing as the pale, elongated figure I'd seen in her photographs. I splashed into the water, hoping to reach one of the other small islands I'd spotted during my searches. The swamp was warm as blood and thick with vegetation that grabbed at my legs. Something large brushed past my thigh underwater, but I was more afraid of what pursued me than what might be lurking beneath the surface. The flashlight died just as I reached another patch of dry ground. In the absolute darkness, I pressed myself against the trunk of a massive cypress and tried to control my breathing. The creature, whatever it was, had gone silent. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. In the darkness, time became meaningless. I began to doubt my own memories. Had I really seen Sarah transform? Or was I suffering from exposure, dehydration, and stress-induced hallucinations? Then I heard her voice again, soft and pleading. "Michael, where are you? I'm hurt. I need help." It sounded exactly like Sarah. Not the distorted version from the campsite, but my Sarah, frightened and in pain. Every instinct screamed at me to respond, to find her and help her. But I forced myself to remain silent. "Please, Michael. I can't find the camp. I'm bleeding." The voice was moving, circling my position in the darkness. Sometimes it came from the left, sometimes from directly ahead. Once it seemed to come from directly above, as if something was speaking from the cypress canopy. "I remember now," the voice continued. "I fell and hit my head. That's why I was acting so strange. I think I have a concussion. Please help me." It was a plausible explanation. Part of me wanted desperately to believe it. But I'd seen the way the thing's face had shifted and changed, heard its inhuman laughter. Whatever was out there in the darkness, it wasn't Sarah. I waited until dawn, barely breathing, listening to that voice call my name in increasingly desperate tones. As the first gray light filtered through the moss, the calls finally stopped. When I was sure it was gone, I began making my way back toward our campsite, moving carefully from tree to tree, constantly checking behind me. The swamp looked different in daylight, older somehow, more primal. The cypress trees seemed larger than they had the day before, their trunks twisted into shapes that hurt to look at directly. I found our camp empty. The tent was still there, along with most of our gear, but Sarah's camera equipment was gone. Her laptop lay open by the dead ashes of our fire, the screen cracked and displaying nothing but static. I packed quickly, taking only the essentials: water, food, and my knife. The creature might return and I needed to reach the trailhead before dark, but as I shouldered my pack I noticed something that made my blood freeze. Fresh footprints led away from the camp, 2 sets this time. One was the elongated clawed tracks I'd seen before. The other was unmistakably human, with the distinctive tread pattern of Sarah's hiking boots. Either the creature was better at mimicking than I'd realized, or... I followed the tracks. They led deeper into the swamp, into areas where the canopy was so thick that noon felt like twilight. The trail wound between ancient cypresses that seemed to lean inward, creating a tunnel of wood and moss. Spanish moss hung so thick I had to push through it like cobwebs. The smell that had bothered me since our arrival grew stronger, sweet and cloying, like flowers mixed with rotting meat. It seemed to cling to my nasal passages, coating my throat with every breath. The tracks led to a clearing I was certain hadn't existed the day before. In the center stood a structure that defied easy description. Part tree, part building, part tumor. Massive cypress trunks had been woven together into a dome-like shape, their branches forming a roof of living wood. Spanish moss draped the structure like curtains, creating shadowy openings that might have been doorways or windows. From inside came a sound that raised every hair on my body, a wet, rhythmic chanting in no language I recognized, and underneath that, barely audible, was weeping. I crept closer, staying low and using the hanging moss for cover. Through one of the openings I could see firelight dancing on the inner walls. The structure was hollow inside, forming a natural cathedral of living wood. What I saw there will haunt me for the rest of my life. Sarah hung suspended in the center of the space, her arms and legs spread wide and bound to the cypress branches with what looked like human hair. She was alive. I could see her chest rising and falling, but her eyes were rolled back, showing only whites. Strange symbols had been carved into her exposed skin, weeping blood that collected in wooden bowls placed beneath her. Around her stood figures that might once have been human but had been changed into something else. They were tall and emaciated, their pale skin stretched tight over elongated bones. Spanish moss hung from their bodies like clothing or fur, and their faces were wrong. Features shifted and flowed like wax in candlelight, sometimes resembling people I might have known, sometimes becoming indescribable amalgamations of flesh and bone. One of them turned toward my hiding place, and I saw that it wore Sarah's face like a mask, but the proportions were wrong. The eyes too large, the mouth stretching nearly from ear to ear. "Michael," it called in Sarah's voice, "come join us. The ceremony is almost complete." I could have run then, should have run, but Sarah was alive, and that meant there was still a chance to save her. I drew my knife and charged into the clearing. The creatures moved with inhuman speed, but they seemed more surprised than threatened by my attack. The one wearing Sarah's face laughed as I slashed at it with my knife, the blade passing through its form like smoke. "You cannot hurt us with steel," it said. "We are older than metal, older than fire." But when I reached Sarah, cutting the bonds that held her suspended, the creature's laughter turned to shrieks of rage. Whatever they had been doing to her, my interference was disrupting it. Sarah's eyes rolled forward, focusing on my face with tremendous effort. "Michael?" she whispered. "Is it really you?" "I'm here," I said, catching her as she fell. "I'm going to get you out of here." The creatures closed in around us, their forms shifting and changing like smoke given flesh. Some took on human appearances, faces I recognized from news reports of missing hikers, people who had vanished in the swamps over the years. Others became things that had never been human, all teeth and claws and hunger. "You have interrupted the feeding," the leader said, its voice echoing from multiple throats. "She was to be transformed, to join us in the spaces between spaces. Now she is neither human nor other, trapped between states of being." I looked down at Sarah and saw what it meant. Her skin was pale and cool to the touch, and strange symbols seemed to move beneath the surface like living tattoos. Her eyes held flecks of something dark and alien. "What did you do to her?" "We gave her a gift," it said. "The gift of hunger. Soon she will crave what we crave, need what we need. Human flesh, human souls, human fear." Sarah's grip on my arm tightened, and I felt the sharp press of what might have been claws. When I looked into her eyes, there was something else looking back. something ancient and hungry and not entirely sane. "Run," she whispered, and her voice held harmonics that human vocal cords could never produce. Before I finish changing, before I become like them. But I couldn't leave her. Even changing, even becoming something monstrous, she was still Sarah, still the woman I loved. The creatures seemed to sense my decision. They drew back, forming a circle around us, and began that wet chanting again. The air inside the clearing grew thick and oppressive, filled with whispers in languages that predated human speech. "You will watch," the leader said. "You will see her complete transformation, and then you will choose, join us willingly. Or become our prey." Sarah convulsed in my arms, her back arching as something moved beneath her skin. The symbols carved into her flesh began to glow with sickly phosphorescence. When she opened her eyes again, they were completely black. "I can taste your thoughts," she said, her voice layered with harmonics. "Your memories, your fears, they taste like copper and salt." Her hand, now tipped with claws, reached up to caress my face. Where she touched me, my skin burned with cold fire. "I love you," I whispered, hoping some part of her could still hear me. For just a moment, her eyes cleared. The real Sarah looked out at me, terrified and heartbroken. "I'm sorry," she said in her own voice. "I'm so sorry." Then the change completed, and she was no longer Sarah at all. The thing that had been my girlfriend threw back its head and screamed, a sound like tearing metal and breaking bones. The creatures around us answered with their own cries, a cacophony of inhuman voices raised in triumph. I had one chance. While they were distracted by their victory, I grabbed a burning branch from their fire and thrust it into the mass of Spanish moss that draped the ceiling. The dried vegetation caught instantly, spreading flames throughout the living cathedral. The creatures' triumph turned to panic. Whatever they were, they feared fire. They scattered like smoke, their forms becoming even less solid as the flames spread. The thing that had been Sarah hissed at me like an angry cat, then dissolved into shadow and fled with the others. The structure began to collapse as the fire consumed the moss and dried branches that held it together. I ran, crashing through burning curtains of Spanish moss and out into the swamp. Behind me, the entire clearing was becoming an inferno. I didn't stop running until I reached our original campsite. The fire was spreading, but slowly. The swamp's moisture would contain it eventually. I gathered our remaining gear and began the long hike back to the trailhead, following the Turner River Trail by memory and instinct. My GPS remained useless, showing impossible coordinates, but I knew the general direction. Keep the sun at my back in the morning, face it in the afternoon, and eventually I'd reach the road. It took me 2 days. I emerged from the swamp dehydrated, exhausted, and half mad with what I'd experienced. The park rangers who found me stumbling along Loop Road took me to the hospital in Naples, where I was treated for exposure and dehydration. When I tried to tell them about Sarah, about what I'd seen in the swamp, they nodded sympathetically and made notes about trauma-induced hallucinations. A search party went out the next day, but they found no trace of our campsite, no evidence of our presence in the preserve. According to their GPS readings, the coordinates I gave them placed our camp in the middle of a deep water slough where camping would have been impossible. The official report listed Sarah Rodriguez as missing, presumed drowned. Her body was never recovered, but I know she's still out there, somewhere in the spaces between spaces that those creatures called home. I've seen her 3 times since that night, once at a gas station outside Everglades City, once reflected in the window of a restaurant in Naples, and once standing at the foot of my bed in the apartment we used to share. Each time, she looks more like them and less like the woman I loved. The humanity drains from her features a little more with each encounter, replaced by something older and hungrier. The last time I saw her, she smiled that too-wide smile and spoke in that harmonically layered voice. "I'm coming home soon, Michael. And when I do, we'll be together forever, just like we planned." I've moved 4 times since then, but distance means nothing to things like her. She'll find me eventually, and when she does, I'll have to choose: become like her or become her prey. Sometimes, late at night when the darkness presses close around my windows, I think I can hear that wet chanting in the distance. And sometimes I find myself humming along. The change has already begun. I can taste your fear through these words, and it tastes like copper and salt. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the Osceola National Forest in northeastern Florida, where the cypress swamps stretch endlessly into darkness and the Spanish moss hangs like dead fingers from ancient trees. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip, just me and 3 coworkers from the insurance office looking to escape the suffocating routine of cubicles and quarterly reports. Sarah Martinez, our claims adjuster, had been the one to suggest it. She'd grown up in Gainesville and claimed to know the perfect spot deep in the forest where we could truly disconnect from civilization. No cell towers, no internet, no bullshit, she'd said with that infectious grin that made everyone in the office gravitate toward her. David Jones, our actuary, had been hesitant at first. At 28, he was the youngest of our group and had never been camping before. His pale complexion and soft hands betrayed a life spent entirely indoors, hunched over spreadsheets and probability calculations. But Sarah had convinced him, promising it would be good for his anxiety. The 4th member of our group was Jennifer Williams, no relation to me despite the shared surname, a tough-talking ex-military woman in her early 40s who handled our fraud investigations. She'd brought enough gear to supply a small expedition. We'd driven out early Friday morning in Jennifer's pickup truck, taking State Road 250 deep into the forest until the pavement gave way to dirt roads that seemed to narrow with each passing mile. The deeper we went, the more the canopy above closed in, filtering the autumn sunlight into dancing shadows that played tricks on the eyes. Spanish moss draped from the cypress trees like tattered burial shrouds, and the air grew thick with the smell of stagnant water and decomposing vegetation. "This is it," Sarah had announced when we reached a small clearing beside a dark creek that meandered through the swampland. "Perfect spot. No one ever comes back here." As I looked around at the isolated campsite, surrounded by towering cypresses whose roots disappeared into murky water, I understood why. The place felt forgotten, like time had stopped here decades ago. But we were all eager to set up camp and start our weekend of disconnection from the digital world. The first sign that something was wrong came that evening as we sat around our campfire, roasting hot dogs and sharing stories from the office. David had been trying to get a signal on his phone to check his work emails. Old habits die hard, when he suddenly frowned. "That's weird," he muttered, staring at his screen. "My phone says it's 3:47 a.m. "Let me see that," Jennifer said, taking the device. Her own phone showed 11:23 p.m. Sarah's showed 8:15 p.m. Mine displayed 2:33 a.m. We all knew it was around 9 in the evening. "Just a glitch," Sarah laughed, but there was something forced about her cheerfulness. That's what we get for bringing technology into the wilderness. We laughed it off, but as the night wore on, other small inconsistencies began to pile up. The fire, which Jennifer had built expertly using techniques from her military days, kept changing colors. Normal orange flames would suddenly flicker blue or green for no apparent reason. The sound of our voices seemed to echo strangely, as if the swamp itself was listening and repeating our words back to us with subtle distortions. When we finally settled into our sleeping bags around midnight, the forest fell unnaturally quiet. No insects chirping, no frogs croaking, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just an oppressive silence that pressed against our eardrums like cotton. I lay awake for what felt like hours, staring up at the canopy where not a single star was visible through the thick cover of moss and leaves. The darkness was absolute, so complete that I couldn't see my own hand when I held it inches from my face. It was the kind of darkness that made you question whether your eyes were even open. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, I heard footsteps. They were soft, careful, circling our campsite at a distance that kept them just beyond the dying light of our fire. Step, step, step. A measured pace, too deliberate to be an animal. I wanted to call out, to alert the others, but something primal in my brain screamed at me to remain perfectly still. The footsteps stopped directly across from where I lay, hidden in the black wall of cypress trees. I held my breath, straining to see or hear anything that might reveal what was watching us. Then, slowly, deliberately, I heard the sound of someone, or something, breathing. Long, deep inhalations followed by even longer exhalations, as if whatever was out there was savoring our scent. When morning came, I convinced myself it had been a dream. Bears lived in these woods after all, and my city-addled brain had probably just transformed normal forest sounds into something sinister. But when we gathered around the rekindled fire for breakfast, David looked as haggard as I felt. "Did anyone else hear that last night?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hear what?" Sarah asked too brightly. "The breathing," David said. "Something was watching us." Jennifer, ever the pragmatist, stood and examined the perimeter of our camp. Her military training had taught her to read signs that the rest of us would miss. When she returned, her face was grim. "There are footprints," she said. "Human footprints. Barefoot. They circle our entire campsite." We all gathered to look at the marks she'd found in the soft earth near the creek. They were definitely human. 5 toes, a distinct heel and arch, but something about them was wrong. They were too long, too narrow, with toes that seemed to stretch and curve in ways that human feet shouldn't. And they were deep, pressed into the mud with more force than seemed possible for someone walking normally. "Probably just some local," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. "These backwoods areas, you get all kinds of characters, probably just curious about our fire." But as we prepared to break camp and move deeper into the forest for our planned 2-day hiking expedition, I noticed Sarah kept glancing over her shoulder at the tree line. Whatever confidence she'd projected was cracking. We packed our gear and set off on the trail that would take us to our second campsite, deeper in the swamp where Sarah promised the best fishing spots could be found. The path was barely visible, more of a game trail than anything humans had made, winding between massive cypress trunks and overfallen logs that served as bridges across stagnant pools of black water. The deeper we hiked, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The canopy grew thicker, blocking out almost all sunlight and creating a perpetual twilight that made it impossible to judge the time of day. Our phones had all died completely, their batteries mysteriously drained despite being fully charged that morning. David's GPS unit showed us moving in impossible directions, sometimes indicating we were traveling north when the moss on the trees clearly showed we were heading south. "I don't like this," David muttered as we stopped for a water break beside a particularly stagnant pool. The water was so dark it looked like oil, reflecting nothing. "I think we should turn back." "Turn back to what?" Jennifer asked, studying her compass with a frown. "According to this, we've been walking in circles for the past hour, but I know damn well we've been following a straight path." Sarah, who had been leading us confidently all morning, suddenly stopped and stared at a tree ahead of us. It was a massive cypress, easily 6 feet in diameter, with Spanish moss hanging so thick it obscured the upper branches. But what had caught her attention were the markings carved into the bark, symbols that looked like a twisted combination of Native American petroglyphs and something much older, much more primal. "I don't remember these," she said quietly. "I've been on this trail before, and these weren't here." The symbols seemed to writhe and shift when you looked at them directly, as if they were carved into living wood that pulsed with some hidden life. They hurt to look at, causing a stabbing pain behind the eyes that made all of us turn away. "Let's just keep moving," Jennifer said, but her hand had unconsciously moved to the knife on her belt. We hiked for another hour before reaching what Sarah assured us was our destination. a small clearing beside a creek that was supposedly perfect for fishing. But as we set up our second camp, the wrongness that had been building all day intensified. Our supplies, which we'd carefully inventoried that morning, were all wrong. David's sleeping bag had somehow acquired 3 long tears that looked like claw marks. Jennifer's first aid kit was missing, though she swore she'd packed it. Most disturbing of all, Sarah's backpack contained items none of us remembered packing. A mason jar filled with what looked like blood, a collection of animal bones tied together with sinew, and a leather journal written in a language none of us could read. "This isn't my stuff," Sarah insisted, her face pale as she stared at the foreign objects. "I don't know how this got in my pack." But as the afternoon wore on, Sarah began to change. Subtle at first, she stopped talking as much, preferring to stare off into the swamp with an expression I couldn't read. When she did speak, her voice had a flat, distant quality that made the hair on my arms stand up. By evening, when we gathered around another fire that refused to burn the right color, Sarah had become someone else entirely. She sat too still, blinked too little, and when she smiled, which she did frequently now, her lips pulled back to reveal too many teeth. "Sarah," David said carefully, "are you feeling all right?" She turned to look at him, and in the firelight I could see that her pupils had expanded to completely black circles that reflected the flames like an animal's eyes. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice came from somewhere else, somewhere deeper than her throat. "Better than fine. I can see so clearly now." Jennifer had noticed it too. Her hand hadn't left her knife since we'd made camp, and she kept positioning herself so she could see all of us at once. Military instincts kicking in, recognizing a threat even if she couldn't define it. "I think we should head back to the truck," Jennifer said. "Sarah, you don't look well. Maybe you picked up something from the water." Sarah's head turned toward Jennifer with a motion that was too quick, too fluid, like a snake striking. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that shouldn't exist in a human throat. "We can't leave," she said. "He's been waiting for us. Waiting so long." "Who's been waiting?" I asked, though every instinct screamed at me not to engage with whatever Sarah was becoming. "The one who walks in stolen skin," she whispered, and her smile widened until it looked like her face might split in half. "The one who tastes memories and dreams of being human." David scrambled backward so quickly he knocked over his water bottle. The sound of it hitting the ground seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive quiet of the swamp. "That's not Sarah," he said, his voice cracking with terror. "That's not her anymore." The thing wearing Sarah's face turned to study David with predatory interest. When it spoke again, Sarah's voice was completely gone, replaced by something that sounded like wind through dead leaves. "Sarah was so easy to slip into," it said. "All those memories of this place, all that love for these dark waters. She led you here so willingly." Jennifer drew her knife, the blade gleaming in the unstable firelight. "What are you?" "I am the hunger that walks between the cypress trees," it said, rising to its feet with movements that bent in directions human joints shouldn't allow. "I am the shadow that wears 1,000 faces. Your people have names for me: Skinwalker, Shapeshifter, Demon, but I am older than your words." As it stood, the thing began to change. Sarah's face started to melt and shift, features flowing like wax. Her clothes hung loose as her body contracted and expanded in impossible ways. Through it all, those black eyes never left us, never blinked, drinking in our terror like wine. "Run," Jennifer whispered, but her voice carried clearly in the dead air. "Run, now." We didn't need to be told twice. David and I bolted into the swamp, crashing through the underbrush as behind us something that had once worn Sarah's face let out a sound no human throat could make. A howl that echoed with the voices of every creature it had ever consumed. The darkness of the swamp was absolute, pressing against us like a living thing. Cypress roots caught our feet, sending us stumbling into stagnant pools that splashed with the sound of disturbed secrets. Behind us, we could hear it following. not running, but moving with a fluid grace that covered ground faster than our panicked flight. "The truck!" David gasped as we ran. "We have to get back to the truck." But the swamp had become a maze. Paths that should have led back to our original campsite instead curved deeper into the wetlands. Our compass spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north in this place where the normal rules seemed suspended. We ran until our lungs burned, until our legs shook with exhaustion, until the sound of pursuit finally faded into the oppressive silence of the deep swamp. When we could run no more, we found ourselves in a small grove of cypress trees whose roots formed natural hiding places in the murky water. "Where's Jennifer?" David whispered as we crouched behind the massive trunk of an ancient tree. I realized with growing horror that somewhere in our panicked flight, we'd lost her. The tough ex-military woman who could handle any crisis had vanished into the darkness, leaving only David and me to face whatever was hunting us. Hours passed. The darkness was so complete we couldn't tell if the sun had set or if the canopy simply blocked all light. Time seemed to stretch and compress randomly. Moments felt like hours, while what seemed like hours passed in the blink of an eye. Then we heard Jennifer calling our names. "Michael! David! Where are you? I'm hurt!" Her voice came from somewhere ahead of us, echoing strangely through the trees. David started to stand, relief flooding his face, but I grabbed his arm and pulled him back down. "Something's wrong," I whispered. Listen to her voice. We waited, hidden in the roots, as Jennifer's calls grew closer. When she finally appeared in the small clearing, I saw what had triggered my instincts. She moved wrong, too smoothly, without the slight limp she'd had since a training accident in the army. Her clothes were pristine, showing no signs of the desperate flight through the swamp. And when she turned her head to scan the area, it rotated just a few degrees too far. "I know you're here," she called, and though the voice was Jennifer's, the cadence was all wrong. "It's safe now. Sarah's gone. I killed it." David looked at me with desperate hope in his eyes, wanting to believe. But I shook my head and pointed to her shadow, which fell in the wrong direction from where the moon should be. Whatever was wearing Jennifer's shape hadn't gotten all the details right. The fake Jennifer searched for us for what felt like hours, sometimes calling our names, sometimes just standing perfectly still and listening. During one of these silent periods, I saw her face change, features flowing and reshaping like clay in the hands of an invisible sculptor. For just a moment, Sarah's face emerged from Jennifer's, then dissolved back into something that was neither. Eventually, it gave up and melted back into the swamp, leaving us alone with our terror. Dawn came slowly, filtering through the canopy as a gradual lessening of the absolute darkness. With light came the courage to move, to try once again to find our way back to civilization. But the swamp had become a funhouse mirror of twisted paths and impossible geography. Every landmark we thought we recognized led us deeper into the wetlands. Trees we were certain we'd passed before stood in different places. The sun, when we could glimpse it through the canopy, seemed to move in the wrong direction across the sky. It was David who first noticed that our footprints in the mud were changing as we walked. What started as normal boot prints gradually shifted and lengthened, taking on the same wrong proportions as the tracks we'd found at our first campsite. "It's in us," he whispered, staring at his own transformed footprints with growing horror. "It's changing us from the inside." I felt it too, a wrongness spreading through my body like ice water in my veins. My vision was becoming sharper, able to pick out details in the shadows that shouldn't have been visible. My hearing had improved to the point where I could detect the heartbeat of small animals hiding in the underbrush. Most disturbing of all, I was beginning to understand the language of the swamp, the whispers in the wind, the secrets the water carried, the stories the trees told with their creaking voices. "We have to fight it," I said, though part of me was beginning to wonder why we should. The change promised such interesting perspectives, such delicious new hungers. David nodded, but his eyes had begun to develop the same black depths I'd seen in Sarah's transformed gaze. When he spoke, his voice carried new harmonics. "Maybe Jennifer was right," he said. Maybe Sarah is gone. Maybe we should find her and make sure. I knew then that I was losing him, just as we'd lost Sarah and Jennifer. The thing in the swamp didn't just hunt. It infected, transformed, recruited, and I was next. Fighting against the growing wrongness in my own mind, I broke away from David and ran blindly through the swamp, no longer caring about direction or navigation. Behind me, I heard him call my name, but the voice was already changing, becoming something else. I ran until I couldn't feel my legs, until my lungs screamed for air, until the world blurred into a kaleidoscope of cypress and shadow and stagnant water. And somehow, impossibly, I found myself back at the dirt road where we'd parked Jennifer's truck. The vehicle sat exactly where we'd left it, keys still in the ignition, as if the past 2 days had been nothing but a fever dream. But when I looked back at the swamp, I could see 3 figures standing at the edge of the trees. They wore the faces of my co-workers, but their smiles were too wide, their eyes too dark, and they watched me with the patient hunger of predators who knew their prey had nowhere left to run. I got in the truck and drove. I drove until the gas tank was empty, until I reached the interstate, until I was surrounded by the familiar noise and light of civilization. But even now, weeks later, I can feel the change continuing inside me. My reflection in mirrors sometimes shows too many teeth. My shadow falls in directions that don't match the light. At night, I dream of cypress trees and stagnant water, of wearing the faces of people I've never met, of the sweet taste of fear and the satisfying crunch of bones between my teeth. The thing in the swamp didn't just hunt us, it planted seeds, and I can feel mine growing stronger every day. Sometimes, late at night, I get the urge to drive back to Osceola National Forest, to walk those twisted paths again, to find my friends who are still waiting in the shadows between the trees. They call to me in voices that are almost human, promising reunion, promising completion. I know that one day soon, I'll answer that call. And when I do, I'll become the thing that leads the next group of unsuspecting victims into the dark heart of the swamp, just as Sarah led us. The cycle continues, the hunger grows, and somewhere in the cypress groves of northeastern Florida, 3 figures with familiar faces wait patiently for their friend to come home.